Hello everyone and welcome back to Nightmare Tales. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to grow louder with each passing night, its metronome-like rhythm, no longer a comfort but a countdown to something I couldn't name. 3 weeks into my countryside, retreat and sleep had become my enemy. I lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams, listening to the old house breathe around me, wood contracting, pipes, groaning and something else, something that moved with purpose. I came here seeking peace. What I found was anything but the listing described it as a charming rural getaway with authentic period features. Real estate speaks for too remote to appeal to most and hasn't been renovated since the Carter administration. But after 6 months of crushing deadlines and panic attacks in my downtown apartment, the peeling wallpaper and creaking floorboards felt like a fair trade for silence, 3 months away from the city's constant drone. That was the prescription I'd written myself. The house sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, half a mile from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by a meadow that gave way to dense woods, single story with a steep pitched roof and windows that seemed too small for the facade. Like narrowed eyes watching approaching visitors, the property manager, a thin man with perpetually moist palms, had handed over the keys. With surprising reluctance. He'd mentioned something about previous tenants rarely completing their lease terms. I'd attributed it to city folks underestimating rural isolation. The first few days passed in blessed monotony. I slept 10 hours straight each night, waking to birdsong. Instead of car alarms, I set up my laptop on the kitchen table, facing the large window overlooking the backyard. My work productivity doubled. I breathed easier. The tightness in my chest loosened. Then came the first morning. I found the kitchen door ajar. It wasn't much, just an inch of space between door and frame, but I distinctly remembered sliding the deadbolt into place the previous night. I always checked the locks twice. City habits die hard. I inspected the frame and lock for damage but found nothing. Must have been the settling of the old house. I reasoned, or perhaps I'd been more exhausted than I realized and had forgotten to secure it properly. The second time it happened 3 days later. I couldn't dismiss it so easily. I had developed a ritual of checking each lock before bed, tugging on handles to confirm they were secure. Yet there it was again, the kitchen door slightly open. Morning light spilling through the gap. I examined the ancient lock, wondering if the mechanism was failing. When I pushed the deadbolt across, it caught with a satisfying think, functional. Then, just to be certain, I placed a chair under the doorknob. That night morning came. The chair remained wedged in place but the deadbolt was unlocked. I told myself there must be a logical explanation. Old houses had quirks. Perhaps temperature changes caused the metal to contract. Maybe I was sleepwalking. I'd never done so before, but stress could trigger unusual behaviors. Seeking reassurance, I called the property manager, keeping my tone casual as I inquired about the house's history and any known issues with the doors. His response came after a significant pause. No, he wasn't aware of any problems with the locks. The house had seen many occupants over its long history, a doctor's residence originally, then a series of short-term tenants in recent decades, nothing unusual to report. His voice had a practiced neutrality that felt rehearsed. Before hanging up, he emphasized that I should call immediately if I experienced any genuine concerns. The distinction between my current worries and what might constitute genuine concerns lingered in my mind that night. I lay awake longer than usual, listening to the house's symphony of small sounds. The wind whistled through cracks in the window frames, the heating system knocked and pinged, the wooden roof beams expanded and contracted, normal house sounds that suddenly seemed coded messages I couldn't decipher. Sleep eventually came, but it was thin and fragile. I woke to the subtle, unmistakable clink of metal against metal. The sound was deliberate. Not the random settling of a house, but purposeful movement. Someone was in my kitchen handling cutlery with slow, careful precision. The digital clock on my nightstand read 3:17 a.m. My heart slammed against my ribs as adrenaline flooded my system. I reached for my phone with trembling fingers, ready to call 911 but stopped. What if the intruder heard me speaking? The metallic tinkling continued, almost delicate. Like someone carefully selecting a utensil, I slipped out of bed. Knees, weak mouth, desert, dry. The baseball bat I'd brought from the city stood propped in the corner, a precaution that had seemed paranoid at the time but now felt woefully inadequate. I gripped it, the wood smooth and cold, against my sweating palms. The short hallway between bedroom and kitchen had never seemed so long. Each step on the wooden floor risked a betraying creak. The sound grew clearer as I approached the unmistakable noise of someone rummaging through my cutlery drawer. With meticulous care, I reached for the light switch, fingers hovering for one paralyzed moment before I flipped it upward. Light flooded the kitchen empty. The cutlery drawer was closed. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the sound had been real. I was certain of it. I stood frozen, bat raised, waiting for movement, for any confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. The kitchen remained still, and ordinary countertops, clean chairs pushed in, morning coffee mug dried beside the sink. I checked the door locked, deadbolt, engaged chair still wedged beneath the handle. After searching every corner of the house and finding no signs of intrusion, I returned to bed but couldn't sleep. Something was in the house with me, something I couldn't see but could feel. Watching me from the dark corners of each room. Morning brought no relief. I woke from what little sleep I'd managed, my body aching as if I'd spent the night in physical combat. Rather than lying motionless in bed, my jaw hurt from clenching. My shoulders felt wound tight as springs. The kitchen door was fully closed, locked and barricaded. Exactly as I'd left it, I began keeping a journal documenting each incident, each strange sound, each inexplicable feeling. The act of recording gave me a sense of control, however illusory. The entries followed a pattern, strange sounds in the night, investigation yielding nothing concrete, followed by a day of rationalization and a night of renewed terror. By the second week, the disturbances had evolved. The cutlery sounds came more frequently, now accompanied by the sensation of footsteps crossing the kitchen floor. Not the sound, but the feeling of weight shifting the ancient floorboards beneath my feet. The temperature would drop suddenly in certain rooms, my breath fogging in air that had been comfortably warm moments before I installed battery-operated security cameras, their red recording lights providing small comfort in the darkness. Each morning I would review the footage with desperate hope, only to find nothing but empty rooms and the occasional shadow that could be attributed to passing headlights. On the distant road, sleep deprivation began taking its toll. During video calls, colleagues commented on my appearance, the dark circles under my eyes, my delayed responses, the way I would sometimes glance suddenly over my shoulder, at nothing they could see. I fabricated a story about an ongoing renovation causing noise problems. It was easier than trying to explain what was really happening, especially when I didn't understand it myself. The night it all escalated remained seared into my memory. I had fallen into an exhausted sleep around midnight, lulled by the rain drumming against the roof. I jerked awake at 3:14 a.m. I'd begun waking at almost exactly the same time each night, but this time something was different. The darkness felt thicker, more substantial. The air in my bedroom seemed to have weight and texture pressing against my skin like damp wool, and something was standing at the foot of my bed. Not a person, at least not entirely. It was more like the suggestion of a human form, a density in the darkness that absorbed what little ambient light filtered through the curtains. I couldn't make out features, just a shape approximately my height, but somehow wrong in its proportions. Arms too long, shoulders at an odd angle. I couldn't move, not a muscle, not even to scream. My body felt pinned to the mattress by an invisible force. The only things I could control were my eyes, which remained fixed on the figure, afraid that if I blinked it would be closer. When I opened them again, we remained in the standoff for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, with a suddenness that startled a gasp from my paralyzed lungs, I could move again. I scrambled for the bedside lamp, fingers clumsy with terror. Light flooded the room, empty. Of course I didn't return to bed. Instead, I spent the remainder of the night in my car, doors locked, engine occasionally running to ward off the pre-dawn chill. When morning finally broke, I called the property manager, abandoning all pretense of casual inquiry. His voice was tight when I described what had been happening. He asked if I'd found anything in the house, specifically in the kitchen or beneath it. When I pressed him for an explanation, he claimed he'd need to consult the property records and would call back. He never did. Using the spotty rural internet connection, I researched the property's history. There was little to find, just property tax records and a brief mention in a local historical society document about the original owner, a doctor who'd practiced from home in the early 1900s. Nothing nefarious, nothing that would explain what was happening. That afternoon I drove into town and visited the local library. The elderly librarian recognized the address. Immediately, when I inquired about the house, her previously friendly expression cooled. She disappeared into a back room and returned with a thin folder explaining that they kept a collection of local newspaper archives. The yellowed clippings told a story the property manager had conveniently omitted. In 1923, the doctor who owned the house had been accused of performing illegal procedures in his kitchen, which doubled as his surgical space. Though never convicted due to insufficient evidence, he'd been ostracized by the community. The final clipping, dated 1925, reported the doctor's commitment to an asylum after claiming his house was infested with the spirits of the vengeful. The librarian watched my face as I read. When I asked if she believed the house was haunted, she merely said that some places retain impressions of what happened there. Before I left, she pressed a small cloth bag of herbs into my palm, a local remedy for unwanted influences, she explained. I returned to the house determined to conduct a more thorough investigation. The kitchen became my focus. I examined every inch, tapping walls for hollow spaces, checking floorboards for loose sections. Behind the refrigerator, I found a seam in the wainscoting that didn't quite match the rest. Prying it open revealed a small door, perhaps 2 feet square. The space beyond was dark and smelled of old earth and something metallic. My flashlight beam revealed a crawl space extending beneath the kitchen. Steeling myself, I squeezed through the opening. The dirt floor was packed hard from age. My light caught something reflective in the corner. Surgical instruments, ancient and rusted, neatly arranged on a rotting cloth. Beside them lay a leather-bound book, its pages swollen with decades of dampness. The journal contained detailed notes on procedures performed, patients, names reduced to initials. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic in later entries, devolving into rambling passages about them coming back night after night, standing at the foot of his bed, following him through the house, touching his instruments, reminding him of his failures. I was so engrossed in reading that I almost missed the sounds above me, the now familiar clink of metal against metal. But it was only mid-afternoon. The disturbances had never occurred. During daylight hours, heart-pounding, I scrambled back through the small door and into the kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating empty countertops. No one was there, but all my kitchen drawers stood open, cutlery disarranged as if sorted through by searching hands. That was enough. I threw essential belongings into my car and drove to the nearest motel, where I spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, jumping at every sound in the neighboring rooms. The next morning I called the property manager and told him I was terminating my lease immediately. He didn't argue. I returned to the house one last time to collect the remainder of my belongings, insisting that the property manager accompany me. He waited in his car while I packed, refusing to enter as I carried out the last box. He finally spoke with reluctant honesty. No tenant had managed to stay more than 4 weeks. Most left suddenly, as I was doing. A few had required medical assistance before they could leave. When I asked why he continued to rent the property, his answer was simple. The owner insists, says the house needs to be occupied. He wouldn't elaborate on who the owner was or why occupancy was necessary. I've been back in my city apartment for 2 weeks now. The panic attacks and work stress seem trivial compared to what I experienced in that house. But sometimes in the darkest hours of the night, I wake suddenly to the phantom sound of metal against metal coming from my kitchen, and though I know it's empty, when I check I can't shake the feeling that something followed me home, something that stands at the foot of my bed each night watching, waiting, something that remembers what I found beneath its kitchen floor. The shadows in my apartment weren't right from the very first night. They stretched too long across the wooden floor, pulled too deeply in corners where light should have reached. But at $850 a month for a studio in the heart of downtown, who was I to complain about? A few strange shadows after the divorce left me with barely enough money for first and last month's rent. I was just grateful to have found a place at all. That was before I understood what the darkness in apartment 307 was hiding. The century-old brick building had seemed like a character-filled sanctuary after months of sleeping on my brother's couch. The real estate agent had called it historic charm, the way the hardwood floor creaked with each step, how the copper pipes knocked when the radiator kicked on the thickness of walls that had witnessed decades of tenants come and go. Now I understand why the previous tenant left so abruptly and why no one questioned my eagerness to sign a lease without a thorough inspection. It started with small disturbances. The first week I noticed how the temperature would drop suddenly in the main room, a chill that would appear without warning and disappear just as mysteriously. My breath would cloud in front of me for a few seconds and then the air would warm again as if nothing had happened. I blamed it on the building's ancient heating system and added another layer to my bedding. Then came the sounds, subtle. At first a faint scratching within the walls that I attributed to mice, the occasional thump from above that I assumed was the tenant in 407, but soon I began to notice patterns. The scratching only happened between 2:17 a.m. and 2:43 a.m. I know because I started logging the times in a notebook kept by my bedside, initially to compile evidence for a complaint to the building manager. The thumping from above came in groups of 3, always 3, even though I later discovered that apartment 407 had been vacant for months. After 3 weeks in the studio, I encountered the first major incident. Returning from a late shift at the warehouse, I fumbled with my keys at the end of the dimly lit third-floor hallway. The building's ancient wiring meant that the hallway lights flickered constantly, creating a disorienting strobe effect that made the corridor seem to stretch and contract. As I worked the stubborn lock, the hairs on the back of my neck stood rigid. My skin prickled with goosebumps. Despite the stuffiness of the unventilated hallway, someone was watching me. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs, but the hallway stretched empty behind me. Yet the sensation only intensified, eyes boring into my back, a presence hovering just beyond my peripheral vision. My hands trembled so violently that it took 3 attempts to get the key into the lock. When I finally stumbled into my apartment and slammed the door shut, my shirt was soaked through with cold sweat and my lungs burned from holding my breath. That night I convinced myself it was just exhaustion. Divorce, financial strain, and 60-hour work weeks would make anyone paranoid. But the feeling returned the next evening and the one after that until going home became an exercise in controlled terror. I began to hear them soon after, the whispers, always when I was alone in my apartment, always when the building had gone quiet for the night. At first they were so faint I thought they might be coming from the adjacent apartment. Muffled voices engaged in hushed conversation, but Mrs. Abernathy in 306 was 87 and lived alone, and 308 had been under renovation for months. I pressed my ear against each wall trying to locate the source, but the whispers seemed to shift, always coming from wherever I wasn't looking. I couldn't make out words. Exactly just the cadence of urgent communication, the rising and falling tones of multiple voices speaking over each other. Sometimes they would stop abruptly if I moved too quickly or turned on a light. Other times they would grow louder when I tried to sleep, as if encouraged by my vulnerability. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford. My work performance suffered. Dark circles formed under my eyes and my hands developed a constant subtle tremor. My supervisor at the warehouse pulled me aside to ask if I was on something, and I couldn't even muster the energy to be offended. How could I explain that the 3 hours of sleep I managed to get each night were haunted by dreams of being watched by something that lurked in the corners of my room? The shadows were the worst part. In the 6 weeks since moving in, I had begun to notice one particular shadow that didn't behave like the others. It appeared in the corner of the main room near the kitchenette, a dense black silhouette that seemed more solid than a mere absence of light. It never appeared when lights were on, only revealing itself in the half-darkness of dawn or dusk, or when only my small bedside lamp illuminated the studio. Unlike the other shadows that shifted predictably with the angle of light, this one moved independently. Sometimes it grew taller, stretching toward the ceiling like a pillar of darkness. Other times it would crouch low, hugging the floor like a predator ready to pounce. I began to avoid looking directly at that corner, afraid that acknowledging its presence would somehow strengthen it. I tried confiding in my brother during one of our infrequent phone calls. He listened patiently as I described the whispers, the sensation of being followed, the shadow that moved on its own. When I finished, the silence on the line stretched uncomfortably before. He suggested with careful neutrality that perhaps I should talk to someone professional. The concern in his voice made it clear what he was thinking, that the divorce had broken something in me, that I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe he was right. By the 8th week, I had developed routines to manage my fear. I never entered the apartment without first flipping on every light switch. I kept the TV on constantly to drown out the whispers. I pushed my bed to the center of the room, as far from the walls and corners as possible. I taped aluminum foil over the windows to prevent shadows from forming. The building manager knocked once to ask about the foil, raising an eyebrow at my mumbled explanation about light sensitivity, but he didn't press the issue. Then came the night that changed everything. A powerful thunderstorm had knocked out power to the entire block. I returned from work to find the building swathed in darkness. My phone battery was at 12%, not enough to provide sustained light. With shaking hands, I dug out the emergency candles I'd stashed in my backpack. After the whispers began, the match flared momentarily, blinding me. As I lit the first candle, the small flame cast long dancing shadows across the walls of my studio. I froze, watching in horror, as the darkness in the corner by the kitchenette seemed to absorb the candle light rather than be dispelled by it. The shadow there was denser than ever, a black hole amid the gloom. As I stared, unable to look away, the whispers started louder than I'd ever heard them before. No longer muffled, they filled the room with a cacophony of urgent hissing voices. I still couldn't make out distinct words, but the tone had changed. There was an undercurrent of excitement, of anticipation. My breath came in short, painful gasps. Sweat trickled down my spine, despite the chill that had descended on the room. I backed away from the corner toward the door, but froze when I felt something brush against the back of my neck, a cold touch like fingers made of fog. The candle flickered violently, and in that moment of wavering light, I saw the shadow move. It detached itself from the corner and stretched across the floor, not flowing like spilled ink, but moving with purpose, with intention. My legs gave out beneath me and I collapsed onto the hard wooden floor, the impact sending jolts of pain up my spine. The candle rolled from my hand, extinguishing itself and plunging the room into perfect darkness. In that blackness, with my phone's flashlight feature fumbled on with trembling fingers, I finally saw it clearly. For the first time, the shadow had formed, now a silhouette that suggested shoulders, a torso, a head without distinct features. It hovered at the edge of my phone's meager light, neither advancing nor retreating, watching me with an attention I could feel like physical pressure against my skin. The whispers reached a crescendo around me, and suddenly, with terrifying clarity, I could understand one phrase repeated over and over: "You see us now." My throat constricted with terror. I couldn't scream, couldn't move, could barely breathe, as the shadow figure took one gliding step toward me, then another. My phone's flashlight began to dim the battery, failing at the worst possible moment. As darkness crept in from the edges of my vision, the shadow loomed larger. What happened next remains fragmented in my memory. I remember scrambling backward, my shoulder blades hitting the door. I remember fumbling with the knob, fingers slippery with sweat. I remember tumbling into the hallway and the sound of my own ragged breathing echoing off the walls as I ran toward the stairwell. I spent that night in my car, parked under the bright lights of a 24-hour supermarket's parking lot. When morning came, I returned to the apartment only long enough to grab essential documents and a change of clothes. The shadow was gone, retreated to its corner in the daylight, but the whispers persisted, a constant susurration just at the edge of hearing. I broke my lease that day, forfeiting my security deposit without argument. The building manager seemed unsurprised, almost relieved. As I handed over my keys, I asked him, trying to keep my voice casual, how many tenants had occupied apartment 307 in the past year. His expression shuddered and he muttered something about high turnover in old buildings before hurrying back to his office. That was 3 months ago. I've since found a roommate situation in a modern apartment complex across town, all white walls and recessed lighting, not a shadow to be found. My sleep has improved, though I still keep a light on. At night, the whispers have stopped, but sometimes when I'm drifting off to sleep I catch myself straining to hear them. Yesterday I ran into Mrs. Abernathy at the grocery store. She recognized me immediately and gripped my arm with surprising strength for someone her age. She asked if I'd heard about the young woman who moved into 37 after me. According to building gossip, she'd been found in the hallway outside her apartment in the middle of the night, unresponsive, eyes open but seeing nothing, her lips moving in what paramedics described as silent conversation. She's recovering at County General's psychiatric ward. Apparently, Mrs. Abernathy leaned in close, then her breath smelling of peppermints and coffee, and whispered that no one ever stays in 307 for long, not since the original occupant back in the 1930s was found there. After spending 3 weeks alone in the apartment, he'd covered every surface with frantic writing, the same phrase repeated thousands of times. They whisper to be heard. They shadow to be seen. I've been researching the building's history since that conversation. Property records show that the original structure was built on the site of a meeting house where spiritualists gathered in the late 1800s to attempt communication with the other side. Their leader believed that shadows were tears in reality, places where the veil between worlds grew thin. I don't know what exists in the darkness of apartment 307. I don't know if the whispers were trying to tell me something or lure me somewhere, but sometimes when I catch a glimpse of a shadow in my peripheral vision, I find myself straining to hear if it has something to say, because the most terrifying realization isn't that something was there in that apartment with me. It's that part of me misses it. The sound of footsteps shouldn't terrify a grown man. Yet here I was, heart hammering against my ribs, sweat beating across my forehead as I stared at the ceiling, listening to the slow, methodical steps dragging across the wooden planks outside my door. I'd come to the seaside in seeking solitude and peace, but what I'd found instead was a nightly visitor that existed only in sound, never in sight, leaving me questioning not just my safety but my very sanity. I'd arrived at the Driftwood 5 days ago, desperate for escape after months of mounting pressure at work and the fresh wound of a relationship that had imploded spectacularly. The modest inn sat perched on a rocky outcropping, the constant crash of waves against the cliffs below, serving as a natural white noise machine. It wasn't fancy. Just a dozen rooms arranged in a horseshoe shape around a central courtyard connected by an exterior-covered walkway that offered views of the churning ocean beyond my room. Number 8 was positioned at the far end of the eastern wing, the last in a row of identical weathered doors. The first night passed uneventfully. I fell asleep to the rhythm of the ocean, exhausted from the 6-hour drive. It was the second night when I first heard them footsteps in the corridor outside my room, at precisely 2:07 a.m., according to the harsh red digits of the bedside clock. The sound had pulled me from a dreamless sleep, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to drag slightly, as if whoever was walking was injured or carrying something heavy. The footsteps moved past my door, continued to the end of the walkway, paused for exactly 12 seconds, then reversed direction, passing my door again before fading into silence. I'd gotten up, peered through a gap in the faded blue curtains, but saw only empty wooden boards bathed in the dim yellow glow of the pathway lights. I dismissed it as another guest with insomnia, until it happened again the next night at the exact same time, following the identical pattern, and again the night after that. By the fourth morning, dark circles had formed under my eyes. My hands trembled slightly as I stirred sugar into my coffee. In the inn's modest breakfast room, the elderly owner, Mr. Keegan, a wiry man with skin tanned to leather from decades of coastal sun, asked if I was enjoying my stay. When I mentioned the nocturnal disturbances, his weathered face twitched almost imperceptibly. He offered a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes and stated that the old corridors always had strange noises. Just the wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes. Nothing to worry about. But wood doesn't expand and contract in footstep patterns, and temperature changes don't occur with clockwork precision at 207 every morning. I spent that day walking the beach trying to convince myself that I was being ridiculous. Yet I couldn't shake the crawling sensation between my shoulder blades, a feeling of being watched that persisted even when I was alone on stretches of empty shore. I found myself taking photos of the inn from different angles, studying them later on my phone, searching for what exactly I couldn't say, but something about the place felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. That evening I noticed things I'd overlooked before, the way other guests seemed to avoid eye contact in the common areas. How conversations would halt abruptly when I entered the breakfast room. The strange collection of nautical knots framed behind the front desk, intricate, complex patterns that seemed to form symbols if you stared at them long enough. The fact that, despite the inn being supposedly at capacity, according to Mr. Keegan, I'd only ever seen 4 other guests. I returned to my room early, determined to stay awake until 2:07 a.m. I positioned a chair next to the door, leaving the curtains partially open to allow in the moonlight. I didn't want to turn on lights that might alert whatever or whoever was making those footsteps that I was waiting. My mouth went dry as the digital clock ticked over to 2:06 a.m. My pulse throbbed in my temples, fingers gripping the armrest so tightly. My knuckles glowed white in the dim light. At exactly 207 it began the unmistakable sound of weight settling onto the wooden boards, followed by the slow dragster that I'd come to dread, my throat constricted as the footsteps approached my door. They seemed louder tonight, more deliberate, as if whoever was making them knew I was listening, wanted me to listen. They paused directly outside my door, something they hadn't done on previous nights. The silence stretched my breathing, shallow and rapid. Then came a sound that sent ice water coursing through my veins, a soft scratch against the wood of my door, as if someone was tracing patterns with their fingernails. It continued for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds before the footsteps resumed, continuing to the end of the walkway. I sat frozen, unable to move even after the footsteps had faded completely. When I finally gathered the courage to open the door, I found the corridor empty, as expected, but something new caught my eye, a faint marking on my door at about shoulder height. In the dim light, it appeared to be a symbol scratched into the wood, similar to the knots I'd seen displayed behind the reception desk. I slept fitfully for what remained of the night, my dreams plagued by visions of faceless figures standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with eyes I couldn't see. The next morning I examined my door. In daylight, the marking was barely visible, 3 intersecting curves, forming something that resembled an eye or perhaps a whirlpool. I might have dismissed it as an old scratch if I hadn't recognized its similarity to the knotwork patterns in the lobby. When I approached Mr. Keegan about checking out early, citing a family emergency, his expression remained impassive, but I detected a flicker of something relief concern in his eyes. He informed me that refunds weren't possible for early departures per the policy I'd agreed to upon check-in. The thought of losing the money I'd paid for the full week bothered me less than the idea of spending another night in room 8. As I turned to leave, he called after me, suggesting I might prefer to switch to a different room, perhaps number 3 on the opposite wing, which had a much better view. Something in his tone made my skin prickle. I declined, saying I'd stay in my current room for the remainder of my booking. I'm not sure why I lied. Some stubborn part of me refused to be chased away, while another part one didn't fully understand needed to know what was happening. I spent the afternoon in town browsing the local library's collection of regional history books. I found nothing specific about the Driftwood Inn, but discovered unsettling references to coastal disappearances dating back decades, primarily lone travelers who'd come to this stretch of coastline and simply vanished. Local legends spoke of the sea, claiming those who were drawn to its voice. Whatever that meant. I returned to the inn as dusk settled, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. With each passing hour I tried to distract myself with television, but the ancient set produced only static fill images and distorted sound. My phone showed no service, not unusual given the remote location, but tonight it felt deliberate, isolating. At midnight I prepared for what I knew would come. I pushed the room's heavy dresser across the floor, positioning it against the door. I placed a glass of water on its surface, recalling reading somewhere that vibrations would disturb the water's surface, potentially revealing movement too subtle for the human eye. Then I waited, sitting on the edge of the bed, every muscle tense. The minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. At 2:05, the temperature in the room plummeted so suddenly that my breath clouded in front of my face. The bedside lamp flickered once, twice, then stabilized, casting long shadows across the walls. I watched the digital clock, my hands trembling uncontrollably as it changed to 206, then 207. The footsteps began, but something was different tonight. They started not at the far end of the corridor, but directly outside my door. The water in the glass rippled tiny concentric circles expanding outward. A crushing weight seemed to press against my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. Draxed step, moving away from my door, now toward the end of the walkway. Then silence for exactly 12 seconds, followed by the returning footsteps. As they approached my door again, the dresser began to vibrate subtly against the floor. The water in the glass sloshed against its sides. The footsteps stopped directly outside, and then the sound that would haunt me for years to come, a soft, wet inhalation, as if whatever stood there was breathing in my scent through the wooden barrier. The doorknob rattled gently at first. Then with increasing force, I sat paralyzed, watching as it turned fully to the right, then the left testing the lock. The dresser shuddered against the door as something pressed against it from the outside, the weight causing the wood to creak in protest. And then a voice, or something approximating a voice, seeped through the cracks around the door frame. It was barely audible, like the whisper of sand shifting on the shore, forming words that seemed to materialize directly inside my head rather than passing through my ears. "Let me in," it hissed, the sound sending violent tremors down my spine. "I've been waiting every night, let me." In my vision, tunneled black edges encroaching as hyperventilation threatened to overwhelm me. The pressure against the door increased, the dresser sliding forward an inch across the floor. The wood of the door itself began to bow inward slightly at the center, as if softening under impossible pressure. In that moment of pure terror, clarity struck with the force of a physical blow. I lunged for my phone, hands shaking so violently I could barely operate it. There was still no service, but I activated the flashlight function and directed its harsh beam at the distorting door. The pressure ceased instantly. The temperature rose several degrees in the span of seconds. From outside came a sound like steam escaping a kettle, a high thin wail of what I could only interpret as pain or frustration. The footsteps retreated rapidly, no longer measured and deliberate but frantic, fading into the distance. I kept the light trained on the door until my arm ached, afraid to lower it even for a moment. I didn't sleep as the first grey light of dawn filtered through the curtains. I packed my belongings with mechanical efficiency. I left the key on the dresser, which I'd returned to its original position, and departed without checking out, formally abandoning the remainder of my paid stay without a backward glance. As I threw my bag into the trunk of my car, I noticed Mr. Keegan watching from the lobby window. His expression unreadable. He raised one hand in what might have been a farewell or perhaps a warning. I've spent months researching the driftwood since my return home. Property records show it's changed ownership 17 times in the past 60 years, an unusually high turnover rate. I found archived newspaper clippings mentioning strange occurrences in the area, including multiple reports of night terrors experienced by guests at various local accommodations. Most disturbing was what I discovered about Room 8. Specifically, in a forum dedicated to paranormal experiences, I found an account from 1998 describing identical footsteps outside that same room. The poster had fled after 3 nights, but not before taking a photograph of a marking they'd found scratched into their door, 3 intersecting curves forming an eye-like symbol. I don't know what walked that corridor at the Driftwood Inn. I don't know why it chose my door or what would have happened had the dresser not held. What I do know is that something was collecting visitors there, something that required permission to enter that couldn't bear the direct light of human technology that had patience spanning decades. Sometimes when I'm drifting off to sleep, I catch myself listening for footsteps in the hallway of my apartment building, and on nights, when my neighbor returns home late, their tread heavy in the corridor, I find myself staring at my door, watching the handle with unblinking intensity, remembering the voice that still echoes in my dreams. Let me in. I've been waiting. I'll always be waiting. The highway stretches before me like a black ribbon cutting through the night, my headlights carving a tunnel of visibility into the darkness. It's 3:17 a.m., the witching hour. Some would say I've never been superstitious. But after 3 weeks on this midnight route, I've started to understand why our ancestors feared the dark. Sometimes, in places like this deserted stretch of Highway 16, the membrane between our world and whatever lies beyond feels paper-thin. Tonight that membrane tears completely. My name is Daniel Mercer. I work the night shift at Lakeside Memorial, a private hospital nestled in the Pines, 20 m outside of town. The pay is excellent, the patients are fewer than the day shift, and the quiet suits me, or it did until the recording started. The first incident happened 3 weeks ago. I was driving home after a particularly grueling 12-hour shift. A terminal patient had coded twice on my watch. Both times we'd managed to bring him back, but the strain of holding death at bay had left me exhausted. The digital clock on my dashboard read 3:24 a.m. When I remembered I hadn't confirmed plans with Mark for the weekend, I pulled onto the shoulder near mile marker 36, right where the highway cuts through Blackwood Forest. The spot was identical to a dozen others along my route: gravel shoulder, dense trees, the occasional reflective eyes of woodland creatures watching from the underbrush. Nothing special about it, nothing that would explain what happened. Next I picked up my phone, tapped the voice message icon and began recording. "Hey, Mark just finished my shift about Saturday. I was thinking we could." A burst of static cut through my words, sharp and sudden, like feedback from an amplifier. It lasted only a second before fading. I figured it was just cellular interference, not uncommon in these remote stretches. I finished my message, hit send, then played it back to make sure it was audible. My blood ran cold beneath my voice, barely perceptible, but unmistakably there was another voice. It wasn't speaking words so much as exhaling them, a whisper that seemed to crawl underneath my own voice. I couldn't make out what it said, but the cadence was wrong, all wrong. Like someone trying to imitate human speech without understanding how our lungs and vocal cords function, I deleted the message immediately. My rational mind supplied explanations. Radio interference crossed signals, some quirk of digital compression. But the primitive part of my brain, the part that evolved to fear the dark and what might lurk within it, knew better. Something had hijacked my message, something had spoken. When I wasn't aware of anyone listening, I drove the rest of the way home with the radio blasting, desperate to drown out the memory of that whisper. The next night was my day off. I slept poorly, dreams filled with static and voices calling my name from distant rooms. When I returned to work the following evening, I asked the other night shift nurses if they'd ever experienced anything strange on their commutes home. They shared the usual horror stories: deer darting across the road, falling asleep at the wheel, the occasional drunk driver, but nothing like what I'd heard. Steve, an orderly who'd worked at Lakeside for 15 years, mentioned that the stretch near Blackwood had poor reception. Something about the geography, he said. The locals called it the dead zone for the next few nights. I avoided sending any messages during my drive, but curiosity gnawed at me. The rational part of my brain needed an explanation, something concrete to file away and forget. So 5 nights after the initial incident, I pulled over at the exact same spot. The night was moonless, the darkness absolute. Except for my headlights. I rolled down my window slightly, listening nothing but the ambient sounds of the forest wind through pine needles, distant owl hoots, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I started recording, testing just a test message. I said keeping it brief. The static returned louder. This time it didn't just interrupt my voice, it seemed to swallow it. And when I played it back, the whispering was clearer, still unintelligible. But now I could discern multiple voices overlapping, speaking in what sounded like urgent tones. They reminded me of patients coming out of anesthesia, that confused muttering as consciousness returns. But before coherence, my hands trembled as I deleted the recording. The car suddenly felt too small, too exposed. I rolled up my window, locked the doors and drove away, pushing well past the speed limit. Over the next 2 weeks I took a different route home, a 40-minute detour that added significant time to my commute. I told myself it was to avoid construction, but I knew the truth. I was avoiding mile marker 36. The strange thing was I found myself thinking about it constantly. The whispers had embedded themselves in my mind. I would catch myself straining to understand them, as if the meaning might suddenly become clear. In retrospect, sleep became elusive. When I did manage to drift off, I dreamed of standing in the middle of that empty highway. My phone held up like an offering while shadows gathered at the tree-in. Last night, exhaustion and pragmatism won out over fear. The detour was adding stress to an already demanding schedule. I decided to take my usual route home but drive straight through without stopping. No recordings, no tempting whatever dwelled there. Just drive and get home. The plan worked fine until my sister called Sarah never calls late and my mind immediately went to our mother, whose health had been declining. I had to answer. The call dropped almost immediately, just as I was passing mile marker 36. The display showed no service, despite having full bars. Moments before I knew I shouldn't stop. Every instinct screamed against it, but if something had happened to Mom, I needed to know. I pulled over in the exact same spot as before and tried calling Sarah back. Nothing. Text messages failed to send. With growing dread, I decided to send her a voice message, which would deliver once I regained service. The moment I hit record, the static returned a wall of electronic noise, so loud I dropped my phone. It continued emanating from the speaker, growing in intensity. I fumbled to cancel the recording, but the screen had frozen. The static began to resolve itself into voices, dozens of them overlapping in a cacophony of whispers, still unintelligible individually but collectively, forming a pattern that almost made sense. Then my headlights flickered once, twice, and went out completely. The engine stalled in the sudden silence and darkness. The whispers from my phone seemed to fill the car, spilling out into the night around me. My skin prickled with goosebumps as I realized the whispers weren't just coming from my phone anymore. They surrounded the car. I could hear them just beyond the glass, a chorus of desperate, urgent murmuring. With shaking hands, I tried the ignition. Nothing. The car was dead. My phone screen provided the only light, casting my terrified face in a ghostly blue glow. The recording was still going, the timer ticking upward. I squinted into the darkness beyond my windows. The night seemed to press against the glass like something solid. I couldn't see anything, but I felt observed, as if the darkness itself had developed consciousness and was studying me with patient malevolence. My breath fogged the window as my respiratory rate increased. I could hear my heartbeat thundering in my ears, almost, but not quite, drowning out the whispers. My mouth went dry. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill. Then I saw them, or rather I saw the absence of them, shapes in the darkness, defined not by their form but by how they moved the night around them. They circled the car, wispy and insubstantial, some tall and stretched, others hunched and compact. Their movements were wrong, jerky and too quick, then unnaturally slow, as if they weren't fully anchored to the same physics that governed my world. One approached my window. I couldn't make out features, just a vague suggestion of a face. It pressed against the glass, leaving no fog. Despite the cold, the whispers grew more intense, more focused. For a terrifying moment, I thought the window would give way. In desperation, I tried the ignition again. To my shock, the engine roared to life. The headlights blazed, cutting through the darkness and through the figures. They dispersed like smoke, but the whispers remained. I threw the car into drive and floored the accelerator tires, spinning on gravel before finding purchase. As I pulled away, I glanced at my phone. The recording had stopped. Without thinking, I played it back. This time, among the static and competing whispers, one voice emerged clearly. It spoke 7 words that turned my blood to ice. "We've been trying to reach you, Daniel, my name." It knew my name. "I've called in sick the past 3 days. My supervisor is understanding but concerned. I've told no one who would believe me. Instead, I've been researching. The stretch of Highway 16 that runs through Blackwood has a history not widely known, not reported in official records but whispered about in local forums and community groups. There have been an unusual number of single car accidents along that stretch, not fatalities. The reports specifically note that the drivers survived but were found in states of extreme distress. Many claimed electrical failures preceded their accidents. Some were admitted to psychiatric care afterward, insisting they heard voices before losing control. The land was once part of a property owned by a research facility in the 1970s. The records are sparse, but there are mentions of experimental communication technologies being developed there. Some say they were attempting to use certain frequencies to enhance cognition. Others suggest more fringe research attempts to contact elsewhere. I don't know what to believe anymore. I only know what I experienced was real. Yesterday I received a voicemail from an unknown number, nothing but static for 30 seconds, then barely audible mile marker 36 midnight. We need you to listen. Tonight is my first shift back at work. I've requested a transfer to day shifts, but it will take weeks to process. Until then I have decisions to make. Do I take the long detour home? Do I dare stop at mile marker 36 again? Part of me is terrified at the thought, but another part, a growing part, needs to understand. The voices know me. They've been trying to reach me specifically why what message is so important that it bleeds through from wherever or whatever they are. I've purchased a high-quality digital recorder. If I do stop tonight, and God help me, I think I will. I want to capture whatever comes through with perfect clarity. Maybe then I'll understand what they're trying to tell me. Maybe then I'll know why, when I close my eyes, I can still see those shapes moving through the darkness, reaching for me with limbs that bend in too many places. There's a theory. I keep coming back to something a patient said during a bout of anesthesia-induced delirium last year. He grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and told me that reality is just a consensus. We only perceive what we collectively agree to perceive. Sometimes, in certain places, that consensus breaks down. I think mile marker 36 is such a place. I think something has been there all along, just beyond the veil of our agreed upon reality, and somehow, for reasons I can't fathom, it's chosen me to hear its message. My shift starts in an hour. By dawn tomorrow I'll either have answers or I'll be another story whispered about on local forums, another driver found in a state of unexplainable distress. Either way I'll be bringing my recorder. Either way I'll finally listen to what the voices at mile marker 36 have been trying to tell me. Because the most terrifying realization I've come to is this. Despite my fear, despite everything rational in me screaming to stay away, I need to know. The whispers have gotten inside my head and now, God help me, I'm starting to whisper back. The first night I heard it, I dismissed it as nothing, a faint murmur of voices drifting through the walls, just another ambient noise in a house that was never truly silent. By the third night I couldn't ignore it anymore. The sound had a rhythm, a pattern like a newscast playing at low volume, but my television was off. It had been off for hours. Living alone in this row house had never bothered me until now. The shared wall with my neighbor had always seemed solid enough, almost soundproof. In the 2 years I'd lived here I'd barely heard anything beyond the occasional thump or muffled conversation. But this was different. This sound didn't belong. I live in a modest 2-story row house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Nothing remarkable about it. Beige siding, small front yard, the kind of place that blends into the background of American life. Inside the ground floor holds my living room, kitchen, and a small hearth. My bedroom and office occupy the second floor, simple, functional and, until recently, comfortable. Tonight marks the 14th consecutive night of the phantom broadcast. I lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint murmur emanating from downstairs. My digital clock reads 2:17 a.m. The voices downstairs continue their unintelligible conversation, the cadence rising and falling like a news anchor delivering the day's events to an audience of no one. My television is downstairs in the living room, unplugged for the past week in a desperate attempt to stop whatever this is. My heartbeat quickens as I swing my legs over the side of the bed. The wooden floor cacks beneath my feet. Cold sweat breaks out across my forehead despite the mild temperature. I grab my phone for its flashlight and begin my nightly ritual of investigation. The staircase stretches before me, each step disappearing into darkness. As I descend, the broadcast grows more distinct, not louder but clearer somehow, as if my movement toward it improves its reception. I can almost make out words now, almost understand what's being said. My throat tightens with each step, mouth going dry. 3 steps from the bottom, the sound cuts out completely silence, perfect, absolute silence. I stand frozen on the stairs, my phone's flashlight beam dancing across the empty living room. Nothing has changed since I went to bed hours ago. The television sits dark and disconnected, a black mirror reflecting my own hunched silhouette. The remote remains on the coffee table untouched. No devices are on, no tablets, no laptops, no forgotten radio. I complete my search anyway, checking every corner behind furniture inside cabinets. I've done this so many times. Now that it's become mechanical, the tremor in my hands has become a permanent fixture. I've taken to biting my nails down to the quick, a nervous habit I thought I'd abandoned in college. My rational mind offers explanations: a neighbor's television sound traveling through pipes, auditory hallucinations from stress or sleep deprivation. But none of these explanations satisfy the primitive part of my brain that just knows something is wrong in my home. After finishing my search, I return upstairs. The clock now reads 2:43 a.m. I sit on the edge of the bed waiting. 3 minutes pass before it starts again, the low murmur of voices discussing unknown topics with urgent importance. I clench my fists, nails digging into my palms. The next morning, blurry-eyed and exhausted, I knock on my neighbor's door. Dave is a middle-aged accountant, divorced, quiet. We exchange pleasantries a few times a month but aren't close. When I ask about his television habits, his expression shifts from friendly to confused. He insists. His only TV is in his upstairs bedroom, on the wall opposite from our shared boundary. He never watches television downstairs, and certainly not at 2 o'clock in the morning. The concern in his eyes makes me backpedal, laughing it off as a weird acoustics issue. I walk away with my stomach in knots, his gaze burning into my back. At work I can barely focus. My eyes burn from lack of sleep, and twice my boss catches me staring blankly at my computer screen. I've taken to researching sound phenomena during lunch breaks, EVPs, audio, pareidolia, infrasound. I've learned more about sound transmission through building materials than I ever wanted to know. I've read accounts of people who heard radio broadcasts through their dental fillings. I even called an exterminator to check for rodents in the walls, though the quiet, pitying look he gave me after his thorough inspection said everything. By week 3 I've installed sound recording equipment, 3 different apps on my phone, a digital recorder placed downstairs, even a parabolic microphone pointed at the wall. Nothing captures the sounds I hear every night. The recordings contain only the ambient noise of the house, the refrigerator's hum, the heating systems, occasional clicks, the distant passage of cars on the street outside. No voices, no broadcast. In desperation, I contacted the previous owner of the house. The conversation was brief and unsettling. She couldn't get off the phone fast enough, her voice rising in pitch. When I mentioned sounds coming from the walls before hanging up, she said something that has lodged in my mind like a splinter. That house takes things from you if you listen too long. Night 32. I've stopped going to work. My boss was understanding at first, but his patience is wearing thin. I've stopped responding to texts from friends. My appearance has deteriorated, dark circles under my eyes, unwashed hair, clothes I've worn for days. Food tastes like ash. The only thing that matters is understanding the broadcast. I've developed a theory. The sounds are consistent but never identical. The voices, usually one main speaker with occasional responses from others, maintain the same tone and cadence. But the content seems to shift. I say seems, because I still can't make out the words, just the shape of them. But tonight will be different. Tonight I won't go upstairs at all. I'll wait in the darkness downstairs completely still, and maybe then the broadcast won't stop. The living room feels different at night. Shadows collect in corners, stretching and contracting with each passing car's headlights. I sit in my armchair facing the blank television screen. 2:14 a.m. It should start any minute now. My breathing is shallow, pulse throbbing in my temples. I've been sitting here for hours, muscles stiff and cramping. The house seems to press in around me, the air thick and stale. I haven't turned on any lights. The darkness is complete, except for the dim glow of street lamps filtering through the blinds. 2:17 a.m. right on schedule. It begins. The sound doesn't come from the walls, as I'd always assumed. It comes from the television itself. The screen remains black, but the voices emerge from it clearer than I've ever heard them. My body goes rigid, every hair standing on end. Cold sweat runs down my spine as I lean forward, straining to understand. For the first time I can make out words. A man's voice, professional and detached, describes what sounds like news items, but the events he's describing are wrong. A massive earthquake in New York City, the emergency evacuation of Chicago, a strange atmospheric phenomenon blocking satellite communications across the northeastern United States. None of this is real. None of this has happened. The voice continues describing casualties and government responses. I realize with growing horror that he's describing events scheduled for tomorrow's date. My breathing becomes erratic, spots dancing before my eyes. I want to run upstairs to follow my usual pattern and make it stop, but I force myself to remain seated. The broadcast continues uninterrupted for almost 20 minutes. Then abruptly it cuts to what sounds like a weather report: severe storms, unprecedented barometric pressure drops. Residents advised to seek shelter immediately. The weather forecaster's voice breaks slightly unprofessional emotion, bleeding through as he gives the coordinates for the storm's epicenter. My address. He just read my exact address. The shaking starts in my hands and spreads until my entire body trembles uncontrollably. I fumble for my phone, dropping it twice before managing to turn on the flashlight. The beam illuminates the television screen, still black and lifeless, yet somehow alive with voices only I can hear. No, not only I can hear, because now there's a response from elsewhere in the room, a soft, staticky acknowledgement of the broadcast. My flashlight beam darts around, wildly searching for the source. There in the corner, furthest from the television, a shape darker than the surrounding darkness, a silhouette that doesn't belong, hunched, and still the beam catches it for just a moment. Not enough to see details, but enough to confirm it's there, something crouched in my living room, listening to the same broadcast I am. The flashlight flickers and dies, plunging me back into darkness as my phone battery depletes. The voices from the television rise in pitch and urgency. I hear my name mentioned, then details about my life, my job, my routine, my recent absence from work. The broadcast has become about me. The figure in the corner shifts and I hear a sound like static, growing louder, drowning out the television voices. I run for the stairs, stumbling in the darkness, one thought pounding in my head. I need to follow the pattern, go upstairs, make it stop, return to bed, wait for it to begin again, the familiar cycle that's kept me safe until now. But halfway up the stairs I realize the voices haven't stopped. They're following me, growing louder rather than fainter. The static rises to a roar that fills my head, pressing against my eardrums until I think they might burst. I collapse on the stairs, hands over my ears, mouth open, in a scream. I can't even hear over the cacophony of sound. Then silence, complete and sudden. I remain on the stairs for hours, too terrified to move up or down. Eventually dawn breaks, pale light filtering through the windows in daylight. I find courage to descend again, inspect the living room. Everything appears normal, no figure in the corner. The television remains unplugged, but on its screen I find fingerprints, dozens of them smeared across the glass as if someone had been pressing against it from the inside trying to get out. I'm moving out today. I've packed only what I can carry, leaving furniture and most possessions behind. I don't know where I'm going, only that I can't stay here. Before leaving, I plug the television back in one last time and turn it on normal channels, normal programs, nothing unusual. As I stand in the doorway, taking one final look at the house, my phone buzzes with a news alert. There's been an earthquake in New York City. I close the door without locking it. Someone or something else lives there now. The broadcast will continue without me, night after night, reporting events yet to happen to an audience of shadows, and somewhere in the static between channels, between worlds, perhaps my name is being spoken by voices that were never meant for human ears. The fluorescent light above my desk flickers 3 times before steadying itself, casting harsh shadows across the empty office. It's 8:47 p.m. and I'm alone on the 14th floor of the Meridian building. Everyone else left hours ago, normal people with normal schedules who don't volunteer for overtime. The building settles around me, contracting in the cooling evening air with faint groans that echo through the ventilation system. I tell myself, these are just the sounds of an aging structure, but lately I've started to wonder. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm a financial analyst at Crestwood Solutions, a mid-sized consulting firm nestled in the heart of downtown Lakewood. The job pays well, though the hours can be grueling, especially during quarter-end reporting. That's why I'm here tonight, hunched over spreadsheets while the world outside continues without me. I've always preferred the quiet of the after-hours office to the chaos of daytime operations. At least I used to. The first incident happened 3 weeks ago. I was working late, just like tonight. When I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a chair rolling across the laminate flooring in the corridor outside my cubicle. Quick, deliberate, as if someone had pushed off with their feet and glided a few feet before stopping. I remember freezing fingers hovering above my keyboard as I tried to identify who might still be in the office at 9:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. Hello, I called out, my voice sounding smaller than intended in the cavernous space. No response came. I pushed back from my desk the wheels of my own chair, making a similar sound that momentarily confused my senses. Standing, I peered over the fabric divider that separated my workspace from the main corridor. Empty, the hallway stretched in both directions, lined with darkened cubicles and closed office doors. Not a single desk lamp illuminated the space besides my own. I walked the entire floor that night, checking conference rooms and break areas, even looking under desks. Nothing. Everyone had gone home. I convinced myself it was the building's ventilation system playing tricks on my tired mind. But it happened again the following week, then again and again. Now it's become a pattern, a bizarre routine that disturbs my once peaceful overtime sessions. The sounds always come from just beyond my field of vision. The rolling chair keyboard clicks from vacant workstations. The soft thud of the copy room door closing when I know I'm alone tonight feels different, though heavier. Somehow the air seems thicker, more resistant. As I move through it, my breath creates small clouds in front of my face, despite the thermostat reading a comfortable 72 degrees. I pull my sweater tighter around my shoulders and try to focus on the quarterly projections. Filling my screen, the security guard, Marcus, passes by on his hourly rounds. He nods at me, his flashlight beam sweeping across the cubicle farm. I've asked him before if he's noticed anything unusual in the building. After hours, his response wasn't comforting. He told me about doors on empty floors that open and close by themselves, elevator calls from unoccupied floors, footsteps and stairwells that lead nowhere. He spoke in a matter-of-fact tone, as if discussing the weather rather than phenomena that defied explanation. I watch Marcus disappear around the corner. The beam of his flashlight growing dimmer until darkness reclaims the hallway. My isolation feels suddenly more pronounced. I check my watch. 9:32 p.m., still a couple of hours of work ahead of me. I return to my spreadsheets, but my concentration is fractured. Every few minutes my eyes dart to the edge of my cubicle, expecting to see a shadow move or a figure appear. The overhead lights hum with an intensity that seems to vibrate inside my skull. I take a sip of cold coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. That's when I hear it, the sound I've come to dread. A chair rolls across the floor, the wheels catching slightly on a floor mat before continuing their journey. It comes from the direction of the break room, perhaps 15 feet from where I sit. My heart rate accelerates instantly, pounding against my rib cage like it's trying to escape. I sit perfectly still, my breathing shallow and controlled. It's nothing, I tell myself, just the building settling or the wind somehow affecting something inside. But there is no wind. On the 14th floor of a sealed office building, I rise slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. Sweat forms along my hairline. Despite the unusual chill, I move toward the sound, my footsteps muffled by the thin carpet. The break room door is partially open. A slice of darkness visible in the gap. I don't remember leaving it that way. My mouth goes dry. As I approach, I push the door open with my fingertips wincing at the soft creak of hinges. The room beyond is dark, save for the faint green glow of the microwave clock. I fumble for the light switch, my fingers trembling slightly against the wall. Light floods the space, revealing nothing. Empty tables, empty chairs, all perfectly in place. I exhale slowly, feeling foolish for my mounting paranoia. My imagination is getting the better of me, fueled by too many late nights and Marcus ghost stories. I turn to leave when something catches my eye. One of the chairs is slightly askew, turned at an angle that doesn't match the others, a detail so minor. Most would overlook it, but I notice, because I'm particular about such things. All chairs tucked neatly under tables, all at right angles to the edge. This one sits at perhaps 40 degrees, as if recently vacated. I approach it, slowly extending my hand to touch the backrest. It's cold, colder than the ambient temperature of the room should allow. My fingers recoil. Instinctively, a shiver runs through me, raising goosebumps along my arms. I straighten the chair and back away, unable to shake the feeling that I've just touched something I shouldn't have. Back at my desk. I try to lose myself in numbers and projections, but my focus is shattered. Every small noise, the hum of the overhead lights, the distant rumble of the HVAC system, the occasional ping of the elevator pulls my attention away. My nerves feel raw, exposed like live wires. At 10:15 p.m. the sensation begins. It starts subtly. A prickling awareness at the base of my skull, the feeling of being watched, observed, studied. I keep my eyes fixed on my computer screen, but my peripheral vision works overtime, searching for movement in the shadows. The feeling intensifies until it's almost unbearable. A pressure against my back so tangible I could believe someone stands directly behind me. I spin around abruptly, half expecting to confront an intruder. There's no one there, just the empty corridor stretching into darkness. Beyond the reach of my desk lamp. My breath comes in short, staccato bursts. My hands shake as I turn back to my computer. The screen has gone dark, not powered off but displaying a blank black screen where my spreadsheet should be. I jiggle the mouse. Nothing happens. I press a key, still nothing. Then slowly a single cursor appears in the center of the screen, blinking rhythmically like a heartbeat. I didn't open a text editor. I wasn't running any program that would create this. As I watch, paralyzed text begins to appear, one character at a time. YOUARENOTALONE. My blood turns to ice in my veins. I jerk back from the desk, the wheels of my chair catching on the carpet and toppling me backward. I hit the floor hard pain, shooting through my elbow and hip. For a long moment I lie there, staring up at the fluorescent lights, trying to process what I've just seen. It has to be a prank. Someone from it playing a sick joke. Or maybe I'm finally cracking. Under the pressure of too many late nights, I pull myself up and look at the screen again. My spreadsheet is there exactly as I left it. No black screen, no cryptic message, just columns of numbers and projections. Staring back at me. I run a trembling hand through my hair, suddenly aware of how hard I'm breathing, how my shirt clings to my sweat-dampened back. Am I losing my mind? I decide I've had enough for one night. The reports can wait until morning. I save my work and shut down my computer, gathering my things with shaking hands. My movements are hurried, uncoordinated. I drop my keys twice before managing to stuff them into my pocket. The elevator feels miles away. I walk quickly down the corridor past darkened cubicles and closed office doors. The sound of my footsteps echoes unnaturally, as if someone else walks just slightly out of sync with me. I resist the urge to run. I press the elevator call button and wait, watching the numbers above the door. The car is on the 3rd floor, ascending slowly, too slowly. I glance back down the hallway toward my desk. The desk lamp I thought I'd turned off glows softly in the distance. I blink and it's dark again. My heart hammers against my ribs. A cold sweat breaks out across my forehead. The elevator continues its languid journey upward 4, 5, 6. That's when I hear it again, the chair rolling across the floor behind me. Not a quick sound this time, but slow, deliberate. Getting closer, I press the button repeatedly, frantically. The elevator crawls upward 7, 8, 9. The rolling sound stops. I sense something directly behind me, a presence so palpable I can feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. My muscles lock in place. I can't turn around, I can't face whatever stands there. The elevator chimes 14. The doors slide open with excruciating slowness. I lunge inside, punching the lobby button and then close door repeatedly. As the doors begin to shut, I finally find the courage to look back. The corridor is empty, no rolling chair, no figure standing where I felt a presence just seconds before. Just as the doors are about to close completely, my desk lamp flickers on again in the distance, then off, then on. Again a deliberate pattern, not random at all. The elevator descends. I lean against the wall, my legs barely supporting me. My reflection in the polished doors looks haggard, pale eyes wide with fear. I barely recognize myself in the lobby. Marcus looks up from his crossword puzzle, eyebrows raised at my disheveled appearance, calling it an early night. "Mr. Mercer?" he asks. I nod, not trusting my voice. He studies me for a moment. Concern evident in his weathered face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he says. His tone light, but his eyes serious. I force a weak laugh and tell him I'm just tired. He nods, but I can tell he doesn't believe me. As I turn to leave, he calls after me. "Mr. Mercer, if I were you, I wouldn't stay so late. This building, it changes after dark." I hurry out into the night, the cool air of blessed relief against my feverish skin. My car sits alone in the far corner of the parking garage. As I fumble with my keys, I glance back at the Meridian building. My eyes travel up to the 14th floor. All the offices are dark except one. My desk lamp glows brightly, a single point of light in the darkness. As I watch, it blinks off, then on, again, then off a pattern, a message. I drive home in a daze, my mind replaying the events of the night. I tell myself I won't go back, that I'll request a transfer to another office or find another job entirely. But even as these thoughts cross my mind, I know they're lies. I'll go back tomorrow and I'll stay late again because something is reaching out from the shadows of that office trying to communicate and, despite the fear that turns my insides to water, I need to know what it wants to tell me. As I pull into my driveway, my phone chimes with a new email notification. It's from my own work account sent just moments ago. The subject line reads simply, "See you tomorrow." I don't open it, I don't need to. I already know I'll be back at my desk after hours waiting in the shadows, waiting to learn what shares that empty office with me when the sun goes down, waiting to discover why of all people it has chosen me. The cold in this place doesn't feel natural. It seeps through the walls like a living thing, searching, probing for weakness. Even now, as I sit huddled before the blazing fireplace, that unnatural chill traces icy fingers along my spine. 3 months ago I bought this mountain chalet as an escape, a weekend sanctuary, from my hectic life in the city. Now I'm trapped in a nightmare of my own making, questioning every shadow, every sound, every fleeting scent that drifts through these wooden rooms, and the most terrifying thought of all. I'm no longer certain I'm alone here. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 40 years old, divorced, and until recently I believed myself to be a rational, level-headed person. That was before I purchased this place, a charming A-frame chalet nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, surrounded by towering pines and breathtaking views. The real estate agent had seemed almost too eager to close the deal, mentioning something about the previous owner leaving unexpectedly. I should have asked more questions. I should have wondered why such a beautiful property was priced so reasonably, but I was entranced by the isolation, the silence, the promise of peace. The first night I spent here remains vivid in my memory. After unpacking my SUV and arranging my basic necessities, I opened a bottle of whiskey to celebrate my new retreat. The autumn evening was cool but pleasant, with a crescent moon hanging low in the darkening sky. I remember standing on the wraparound porch glass in hand, breathing in the pine-scented air and feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what I needed: distance from the divorce papers, the empty apartment, the sympathetic glances from colleagues. But as night fully descended, something changed. The temperature dropped precipitously, far beyond what the weather forecast had predicted. Inside, despite the newly serviced heating system running at full capacity and a fire crackling in the stone fireplace, the cold persisted. It wasn't the ambient temperature thermometers read a comfortable 72 degree, but rather a localized cold that seemed to follow me from room to room. That first night I convinced myself it was simply an adjustment period. My body acclimatizing to the mountain elevation, I put on an extra sweater, poured another whiskey and eventually fell into a restless sleep on the leather sofa before the dying fire. The sound woke me just after 3 a.m., a slow, deliberate creaking of wooden boards, the unmistakable cadence of footsteps moving across the front porch. My heart hammered against my ribs as I jolted upright. Instantly alert, the footsteps continued, step, pause, creak, step, pause, creak, moving methodically across the length of the porch. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and approached the front door, my hand hesitating on the deadbolt. The footsteps stopped directly outside the porch. Light revealed nothing but swaying tree shadows and fallen pine needles. No footprints disturbed the light dusting of frost that had formed on the wooden planks. I made a complete circuit of the property flashlight beam, cutting through the darkness, finding nothing but the sighing wind and watchful trees. When I returned inside, locking the door securely behind me, a new sensation awaited, the faint, barely perceptible scent of perfume hanging in the air, something floral yet earthen, like wild flowers mixed with damp soil. I searched every room, opened every closet, convinced someone must have entered the chalet while I was outside. But the doors remained locked. The windows secured the alarm system untriggered. That was the beginning. Each weekend I returned, determined to enjoy my investment, to dismiss what had happened as a combination of unfamiliar house sounds and an overactive imagination fueled by whiskey and solitude. Each weekend the phenomena intensified. The cold spots became more defined, more purposeful. They would materialize suddenly in rooms. I was about to enter as if something was waiting for me. The temperature would plummet so severely that my breath would fog in the air, only to return to normal when I retreated. The footsteps on the porch became a nightly occurrence, always beginning at the same time, always moving in the same pattern. Sometimes they would stop at the door, other times they would continue around to the back of the house, circling like a predator testing defenses. The perfume scent grew stronger, no longer a suggestion but an undeniable presence. It would appear without warning. While I was preparing dinner, reading by the fire, stepping out of the shower on several occasions, I woke to find it concentrated so heavily around my bed that I gagged, scrambling to open windows, despite the freezing night air. By the sixth weekend, new phenomena emerged. Items moved from where I had placed them, not dramatically. A coffee mug shifted 6 into the left, my reading glasses turned upside down, my car keys hanging from a hook. I never use small displacements, but deliberate enough to make me question my memory, my perception, my sanity. I began documenting everything, installing motion-activated cameras throughout the chalet and on the porch. The footage revealed nothing but occasional interference, static crossing the screen at precisely 3 a.m., lasting exactly 7 minutes. Each time I consulted a local electrician about potential power fluctuations. He checked the wiring and found nothing unusual, though he refused to stay after sundown. Citing the long drive back to town, I spoke with neighbors, the closest being half a mile down the mountain road. Mrs. Abernathy, a year-round resident in her 70s, listened to my carefully edited concerns with narrowed eyes when I mentioned the perfume. Her weathered face palled. She asked if I'd done any renovations, if I disturbed the original structure in any way. When I mentioned my plans to replace some damaged floorboards in the main bedroom, she advised against it with such vehemence that I was taken aback. She wouldn't elaborate further, simply suggesting I researched the property's history before making any changes. The county records proved frustratingly vague. The chalet had been built in 1967 by a couple from Richmond. Over the decades, it had changed hands numerous times with several gaps in the ownership records. Nothing in the official documentation hinted at anything unusual, but when I dug deeper into local newspaper archives, I discovered a pattern. Several owners had left suddenly selling well below market value. One family in the 1980s had abandoned most of their possessions, never returning to claim them. A local history blog mentioned the property briefly in an article about troubled acres places with recurring reports of unexplained phenomena. The blog's author, a self-described paranormal enthusiast named Marcus Webb, agreed to meet me at a diner in the nearby town of Glenwood. Webb was younger than I expected, barely 30, with earnest eyes and nervous hands that constantly rearranged his silverware. He asked detailed questions about my experiences, nodding at certain details as if confirming something to himself. When I described the perfume scent, he pulled out a notebook and showed me similar descriptions from other locations in the area. The same floral earth scent had been reported in at least 7 other properties, all built around the same time as my chalet. He explained that before the development of these vacation properties, The entire mountainside had been part of an old farm belonging to the Corwin family. Emma Corwin, the family's only daughter, had disappeared in the spring of 1955 while collecting wildflowers on the property. Her body was never found, despite extensive searches. According to local legend, she had been known for creating her own perfumes from the wildflowers that grew in abundance across the family land. I dismissed Webb's implications with forced laughter, thanking him for the entertaining local folklore while settling the check. But driving back to the chalet that evening, his words echoed in my mind. The timeline aligned, my property would have been part of the original Corwin land. Still, I prided myself on rationality. Ghost stories were for campfires and children, not for explaining away the settling noises of an aging structure or the power of suggestion on an isolated mind. That night I double-checked every lock, window, and door. Before retiring to bed, I left lights on in the hallway and bathroom, unwilling to admit even to myself that the darkness had become increasingly oppressive. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, it brought vivid dreams of running through unfamiliar woods, searching for something I couldn't name. While a storm gathered overhead, I woke to the sound of splintering wood. My bedside clock read 3:17 a.m. The footsteps on the porch had started on schedule, but instead of their usual pattern, they had stopped. Directly outside my bedroom window, the splintering sound came again, sharp, deliberate pressure being applied to the wooden frame. The window, though securely latched, began to vibrate in its setting as if some impossible force was pressing against it from outside. Frozen in my bedsheets, clutched to my chest like a child hiding from monsters, I watched in horror as frost began to form on the inside of the glass. It spread in delicate ferning patterns, crystallizing with unnatural speed until the entire window was opaque with ice. Behind the frosted barrier, a shadow moved, indistinct but unmistakably human in shape. The temperature in the room plummeted until I could see each panicked breath hanging before me. The perfume smell infiltrated my nostrils stronger than ever before, clawing and overwhelming. My eyes watered, my throat constricted, but I could not look away from that window. The frost began to melt in one specific area, creating a clear circle about the size of a human hand. Through this opening I could see nothing but darkness. Yet I knew with absolute certainty that something was staring back at me. The melted circle began to fog over, then clear again, as if whatever was outside was breathing directly onto the glass. With a surge of desperate courage, I lunged for the bedside. Lamp fingers fumbling for the switch light flooded the room and the shadow behind the frost-covered window retreated. The splintering noises ceased, the temperature began to normalize and the overwhelming perfume scent diminished to its usual faint presence. I did not sleep again that night. At first light I inspected the window from both inside and out. The frost had vanished without a trace, but the wooden frame showed fresh damage, small splinter marks around the edges, as if someone had been systematically testing its strength. That morning I discovered the damage to the floorboards in my bedroom had worsened overnight. A long crack had appeared running from beneath my bed to the far wall. Kneeling to examine it, I noticed something wedged between the boards, a small withered bundle of dried flowers tied with what appeared to be human hair. I should have left then. I should have packed my car and never returned. Instead I pried up the damaged floorboards, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain. Beneath the original flooring lay older planks and between them dozens of similar flower bundles in various states of decay. Some seemed decades old, others fresher, all tied with the same distinctive binding. Embedded in the subflooring I found a small tin box, the kind once used for holding tobacco. Inside was a gyrate photograph of a young woman standing in a field of wild flowers. Her dress was old-fashioned, her expression solemn, on the back written in faded ink, Emma, Spring 1955. I replaced everything exactly as I had found it and carefully resecured the floorboards. That night I left every light in the chalet blazing and sat in the living room, the photograph and one of the flower bundles on the coffee table before me. At precisely 3 a.m., the footsteps began again on the porch. The familiar cold infiltrated the room. The perfume scent strengthened, but instead of revulsion I felt a strange calm. "Emma," I said aloud, my voice sounding foreign in the silent house. "I know who you are." The footsteps stopped. The temperature stabilized, still cool but no longer painfully cold. On the coffee table, the dried flowers in the bundle trembled slightly, though no draft disturbed the air. I continued speaking, explaining that I understood she was connected to this land, that I wasn't attempting to disturb her presence. I found myself promising to preserve the property, to respect its history. As I spoke, the perfume scent changed, suddenly, becoming less overwhelming, more genuinely reminiscent of wild flowers in spring. That was 2 weeks ago. The phenomena haven't ceased, but they've changed character. The footsteps still come each night, but they no longer sound threatening, more like a watchful patrol. The cold spots remain, but they become predictable, almost companionable. On hot afternoons, the perfume scent comes and goes strongest near the repaired floorboards, which I've left accessible beneath a carefully placed rug. I've learned to live with Emma's presence, and I believe she's accepted mine. We've established an uneasy truce, two souls claiming the same space for different reasons. I still lock the doors and windows at night, more from habit than fear. I still start at unexpected noises, still question whether I've truly experienced what I think I have. But on clear nights, when the moon illuminates the mountainside and the wind carries the scent of pine and distant wildflowers, I sit on the porch with 2 glasses of whiskey, one for me, one left untouched on the railing. Sometimes in the morning I find the second glass empty, though it could be evaporation or my imagination, or perhaps something more. I no longer tell myself, I'm alone here. The chalet belongs to both of us, now, the living and whatever. Emma has become not quite a ghost, not quite a memory, but a presence woven into the very wood of this place, as permanent as the mountains themselves. And on the darkest nights, when sleep eludes me and the footsteps circle endlessly, I wonder if it's truly Emma who haunts this place or if something else has taken her name, her story, her scent to mask a more malevolent purpose, something patient enough to wait until I've lowered my guard completely, something that's still waiting for its chance to come. Inside, the fluorescent lights above me flicker with a soft, persistent buzz, a sound that would go unnoticed during daylight hours when the West Ridge Community Center teems with life. At 11:30 p.m., however, that electrical hum seems to pulse through the empty building like a heartbeat. I've grown accustomed to these late-night sessions, volunteering after my day job to sort through donations and organize the Cent's chaotic filing system. What I haven't grown accustomed to is the feeling that I'm never truly alone here. My footsteps echo across the linoleum floor as I move between metal shelving units. The building has stood in this neighborhood since 1962. Its brick facade weathered by decades of rain and snow. Its interior, a patchwork of renovations that never quite erase the original design. Tonight, a steady rain drums against the roof and windows, a rhythmic backdrop to my solitary work. Water occasionally drips through a small leak in the ceiling near the back office, the gentle flip-flop, joining the symphony of subtle sounds that fill the otherwise silent space. I'm reorganizing a box of donated office supplies when the temperature drops. It's subtle at first, just enough to make me pause and look up for my task. The building is old, with heating that works sporadically at best, but this chill feels different. It spreads across my skin like a liquid, raising goosebumps along my arms. My breath fogs slightly in front of my face. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the cold dissipates, leaving me wondering if I imagined it. The motion-sensitive lights in the hallway flicker on. I freeze, listening intently, but hear nothing except the rain and the building's usual creaks and groans. This has happened before. The aging sensors sometimes trigger for no apparent reason. At least that's what I tell myself as I return to sorting through markers and notebooks, ignoring the sweat beating at the nape of my neck despite the lingering chill in the air. 30 minutes later, as I'm filing donation receipts in the main office, I see it again, a shadow moving past the glass pane in the front door. Not the distinct silhouette of a person, but something more fluid, like smoke. Given momentary form, my heart lurches painfully against my ribs. I've seen this shadow perhaps a dozen times over the past few months, always in my peripheral vision, always gone. When I look directly at it, my mouth goes dry as I rise from the desk chair. The metal legs screech against the floor. The sound unnaturally loud. In the quiet building, I tell myself I'm being ridiculous, that it's probably just headlights from a passing car casting strange shadows. The rain has intensified, streaming down the windows and distorting the view of the empty parking lot. Yet something compels me to check. My legs feel lean as I approach the front entrance, each step requiring conscious effort. The glass is cold against my palm as I lean forward to peer through it. Water runs down the other side, transforming the world outside into a twisted, rippling landscape. Nothing moves in the darkness beyond. Yet the certainty that something was there moments ago clings to me like a cobweb. I can't brush away. I'm about to turn back when I hear it faint, almost imperceptible, beneath the sound of rain music, old music with the crackling quality of vinyl played on an antique photograph. The melody drifts from the back corridor where the center stores outdated furniture and equipment. A slow, melancholic tune that brings to mind sepia photographs and dusty memories. My throat constricts as I follow the sound moving past the recreation room with its stacked chairs and folded tables. The hallway ahead is dark. The motion sensors having failed to detect my presence, I fumble along the wall for the manual switch, flicking it upward with trembling fingers. The lights flicker reluctantly to life, buzzing louder than those in the main area. The music grows slightly clearer. A woman's voice singing something about waiting and returning, the lyrics indistinct, but the emotion in her voice unmistakable. It's coming from the storage room at the end of the hall, a room I know, for a fact, contains no radio or speakers of any kind I should leave. Every instinct screams this fact, but curiosity propels me forward. My breathing becomes shallow, my chest tight as though bands are constricting around my lungs. The door to the storage room is slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the gap. As I approach, the music abruptly stops. The sudden silence rings in my ears. As I stand before the door, my hand hovering inches from its surface. When I push it open, the hinges groan in protest. The storage room is a cluttered space filled with items deemed too valuable to discard but not useful enough to keep. Accessible chairs with torn-up upholstery, tables with wobbly legs, filing cabinets from decades past. An old bulletin board leans against one wall, faded notices and yellowed newspaper clippings still pinned to its surface. No radio, no speakers, nothing that could have produced the music I heard moments ago. My skin prickles with the sensation of being watched. I spin around, scanning the shadowy corners of the room, but find myself alone among the forgotten furniture. A framed photograph on the wall catches my attention, a black and white image of the community center's grand opening. Men in suits and women in modest dresses stand before the newly constructed building. Their expressions solemn, despite the celebratory occasion. One face in the crowd seems to stare directly at me, a woman with dark hair and hollow eyes. Something about her expression sends a jolt of recognition through me, though I'm certain I've never seen her before. I lean closer, squinting to make out her features in the grainy photograph. The lights flicker momentarily, plunging the room into darkness. When they stabilize, I could swear. The woman's position in the photograph has shifted slightly, her gaze more directly aligned with mine. My heart hammers against my ribs. As I back away, bumping into a stack of folding chairs that crash to the floor with a deafening clatter, I scramble to right them, my hands shaking so violently I can barely grip the metal frames. That's when I notice the record player. It sits on a shelf I could swear was empty moments ago, an antique photograph with a brass horn and wooden base. The turntable rotates slowly, though no record sits upon it, the needle hovering over empty space as I stare, transfixed. It gradually slows and then stops entirely. I flee the storage room, not bothering to close the door behind me. The hallway seems longer than before, stretching before me like an optical illusion. The motion-activated lights flicker erratically as I run, casting strobing shadows that seem to reach for me from the walls. I'm gasping for breath, my lungs burning, sweat streaming down my face despite the unnatural cold that has descended once more. When I reach the main area, I collapse into a chair, my legs no longer able to support me. My hands tremble uncontrollably as I reach for my phone, unsure who I would even call or what I would say. I think the community center is haunted. I'm losing my mind. Both seem equally plausible in this moment. The rational part of my brain attempts to assert itself. Old buildings make strange noises. The stress of working late nights after full days at my regular job is taking its toll. Perhaps I even dozed off briefly and dreamed the entire episode, but none of these explanations can account for the deep, bone-chilling certainty that something in this building is aware of my presence, something that has been watching me for weeks. I force myself to my feet, determined to gather my belongings and leave. As I pass the front door, movement outside catches my eye. The shadow is there again, more distinct, this time not passing by but standing still, a dark silhouette against the rain-streaked glass. My blood turns to ice in my veins as I realize it's the woman from the photograph. Her features indistinct but recognizable. She raises a hand, pressing her palm against the glass from the outside. Without conscious thought, I find myself moving toward the door, my own hand lifting as if pulled by invisible strings. Some deeply buried instinct screams for me to stop, to run in the opposite direction, but my body no longer seems to be under my control. My fingertips touch the glass opposite hers. The barrier between us feels impossibly thin, vibrating with energy through the rainister window. I see her lips moving, forming words I cannot hear. A sudden overwhelming sadness washes over me, not my emotion, but hers somehow transferring through our connected hands. Images flood my mind. The community center decades ago, when it served a different purpose. A hospital during a long-forgotten epidemic. Patients in quarantine, the woman before me, a nurse who never left, who died within these walls, separated from her family, forgotten by time. She doesn't want to harm me, she wants to be remembered. My vision blurs as tears stream down my face again. Not my emotion, but an echo of hers. Decades of loneliness and isolation condensed into this single moment of connection. The glass between our palms grows warm, then hot, and I jerk my hand away instinctively when I look up. She's gone. Only the empty parking lot remains visible. Through the rain-washed window behind me, the music starts again, clearer, now no longer distant. A woman's voice singing about waiting for someone who never returned. I don't turn around, I don't need to. I know the record player in the storage room is spinning once more, though no physical hands set it in motion. I sink to the floor, my back against the door, and listen until the song ends. When silence falls again, it feels different, not empty but peaceful. The oppressive weight that has hung in the air during my late-night sessions has lifted. The center feels lighter somehow. I still volunteer at the West Ridge Community Center. I still stay late into the night organizing and filing, but now I bring an old radio, tuning it to stations that play music from decades past. Sometimes from the corner of my eye I catch a glimpse of a woman in an outdated nurse's uniform moving among the shelves. Sometimes when I leave files from the Sense history open on the desk, records that mention her name in service, they're rearranged by morning as if someone spent hours reading them. I am not alone in the building, but the presence no longer fills me with dread. Some things are trapped, not by malevolence but by being forgotten. Some hauntings end not when the spirit is banished, but when it's finally acknowledged. And sometimes the most terrifying truth is that the past never truly dies. It simply waits in dark corners for someone to remember it exists. The first night I heard it, I convinced myself it was nothing, just the house settling. These old Victorian structures make all kinds of noises. But now, as I lie rigid in my bed, eyes fixed on the darkened ceiling, I know better. There's something up there, something that waits until the cloak of night before it begins to move, something that seems to know exactly where I am at all times. I inherited this house 3 months ago from my great-uncle, Edwin, a man I met exactly twice in my life. The lawyer called it a substantial estate, but I quickly learned that meant a dilapidated 3-story Victorian in a nearly abandoned neighborhood, filled with antiquated furniture and the lingering scent of mothballs and decay. Still, it was free, and after my divorce and subsequent financial collapse, free was exactly what I needed. The attic was locked. When I arrived, a heavy padlock secured the narrow door at the top of the 3rd floor landing. The real estate agent handed me a rusted key, along with all the others, mentioning offhandedly that my uncle had apparently kept it locked for storage purposes. I had no reason to go up there anyway. The house offered more than enough space for a single man with few possessions, so I left it untouched. For the first 2 months, I focused on making the place habitable. I cleaned, repaired, and painted, settling into a comfortable routine. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, directly beneath the attic's southern end. It was the least drafty room in the house, with tall windows that let in the morning light. I slept dreamlessly there, exhausted from physical labor. That changed 6 nights ago. The tapping began just after midnight. 3 gentle knocks evenly spaced, as if someone testing the resilience of the ceiling with their knuckles. Tap, 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 then silence. I sat up, disoriented, heart suddenly racing. Another set of taps, this time from a spot slightly to the left of the first tap. Tap, tap. I told myself it was a tree branch, or perhaps a raccoon that had somehow found its way into the walls. The house was surrounded by ancient oaks, their limbs stretching toward the roof like gnarled fingers, but deep down I knew the sounds came from inside, not outside. The next morning, standing at the foot of the attic stairs, key in hand, I hesitated. The lock was ancient but well-oiled. It opened smoothly, as if recently used. The door creaked inward, revealing a narrow staircase disappearing into darkness. The air that rushed down carried the musty scent of undisturbed space in something else, something faintly organic, like old sweat. I climbed, slowly testing each stair before putting my full weight on it. At the top I fumbled for a light switch and found a string hanging from an old bulb. The yellow light it cast only emphasized the darkness. In the corners of the vast space, dust motes swirled in the beam. Disturbed by my entrance, after what felt like years of stillness, the attic stretched the entire length of the house, with sloped ceilings and dormer windows covered in grime so thick that only a muddy illumination filtered through stacks of boxes lined the walls, along with furniture draped in yellowed sheets. I moved carefully through the space, checking for signs of animals or water damage, anything that might explain the tapping. Nothing seemed disturbed. No droppings, no nests, no patches of dampness, just decades of accumulated belongings. Meticulously organized, I spent an hour up there, moving from one end to the other, but found nothing suspicious. The area above my bedroom was particularly empty, just bare floorboards, lacking even the layer of dust that covered everything else. That night, exhausted from my exploration, I fell into a deep sleep. I dreamed of voices whispering just beyond comprehension, fingers running along wooden surfaces searching for weakness. I awoke with a start at 3:27 a.m., the glowing numbers of my alarm clock burning in the darkness. The air in my bedroom felt wrong, heavier, as if the oxygen had been partially replaced with something more viscous. And it was cold. Not the natural chill of a fall night, but a penetrating cold that seemed to radiate from above. Then it started again, tap, tap, tap. Directly over my bed I froze, not even breathing, as the sound repeated, tap, tap, tap. Then a new sound, a slow creak of wood bending underweight, as if someone were standing directly above me. I lay paralyzed, sweat beating on my forehead despite the cold. As the sounds continued for nearly 10 minutes. Then silence fell again, broken only by my thundering heartbeat. The next day I returned to the attic, this time with a flashlight powerful enough to illuminate every corner. Again I found nothing out of place. I even got down on my hands and knees to examine the floorboards above my bedroom. They were solid, oak, without cracks or holes walking across them. I couldn't reproduce the exact sounds I'd heard. My footsteps were too heavy, too clumsy compared to the delicate precision of the night visitor. I began researching the house's history, hoping to find some logical explanation. At the local library, the elderly archivist seemed unsurprised by my questions. Through wire-rimmed glasses, she studied me with unexpected intensity when I mentioned my uncle's address. She asked if I'd been experiencing disturbances. Her tone carefully neutral. When I reluctantly described the sounds, she nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. She explained that the house had been in my family for generations, passing always to the most distant relative rather than immediate family. Before my uncle, it belonged to his cousin who had lived there in seclusion for 30 years. Before that, another distant relative, always solitary occupants, always keeping to themselves that night. Determined to confront whatever was happening, I set up a voice recorder in my room and another in the attic. I took sleeping pills to ensure I wouldn't wake during the night, hoping to capture evidence without my own frightened reactions contaminating it. The next morning I reviewed the recordings with trembling hands. My bedroom recorder had captured the now familiar tapping more persistent than before. Between sequences, I could hear what sounded like soft footsteps and the occasional creak of wood, but the attic recorder had picked up nothing. Complete silence for 8 hours straight. My mouth went dry as I replayed the bedroom recording. How could sounds so clearly coming from the attic not register on a device placed exactly where they should originate? The logical part of my brain suggested interference or technical malfunction, but a growing part of me was beginning to accept that logic might not apply to what was happening that night. The tapping began earlier, just as dusk faded from the sky. It was more insistent, no longer tentative. The air grew thick again, making each breath an effort. I lay rigid in bed, eyes fixed upward as sweat soaked through my shirt, despite the unnatural cold. Then something new happened, a scratching sound like fingernails dragging slowly across the ceiling, moving in a deliberate pattern. My vision tunneled, dark edges creeping in as my breath came in shallow gasps. The scratching continued, tracing what felt like symbols above me, curves and lines that seemed to burn into my consciousness, even though I couldn't see them when it finally stopped. I remained frozen until dawn, afraid that any movement might provoke whatever presence loomed above. I called in sick to work the next day, spending hours researching possible explanations, gas leaks that could cause hallucinations, infrasound that might create both auditory phenomena and feelings of dread, psychological responses to isolation. None felt right. The experiences were too consistent, too specific. That afternoon I forced myself to return to the attic, this time with a hammer. I needed to inspect beneath the floorboards where the sounds originated, heart-pounding. I carefully pried up a board in the area above my bed. What I found made my blood run cold. The space between the attic floor and bedroom ceiling wasn't empty as it should have been. Instead, tightly wound bundles of what looked like human hair filled the cavity. Thousands of strands of varying colors and lengths, meticulously gathered and bound with thin wire. Interspersed among them were small objects, buttons, fragments of yellowed paper covered in cramped writing, tiny carved wooden figures. With exaggerated limbs, I recoiled, dropping the hammer with a loud thud. As I scrambled back, my flashlight beam caught something reflective. In the cavity, a small mirror positioned to see through a nearly invisible gap in my bedroom ceiling, someone or something had been watching me sleep. I fled downstairs, grabbing only my phone and car keys. I spent the night at a motel 20 m away, unable to sleep. Despite my exhaustion, my mind kept returning to what I'd discovered, trying to force it into some rational framework and failing. Who had put those items there? My uncle? Someone before him? And why? In the harsh light of morning, embarrassment began to creep in alongside the fear. I told myself I was overreacting to what was probably just some eccentric, relative, strange hobby or superstition. Maybe the hair was animal, not human. Maybe the mirror was for reflecting light into some other part of the house. Maybe I returned home determined to face whatever was happening with scientific detachment. I bought an infrared camera and motion sensors, placing them strategically around my bedroom in the attic. If something was moving up there, I would document it empirically. But when night fell, all my rational intentions crumbled. The atmosphere in the house had changed. Fundamentally, the air felt charged, as if a storm were brewing indoors. The weight above seemed to press down, not just on the ceiling but on my mind, making rational thought increasingly difficult. The tapping began as soon as darkness fell, but it was different now, faster, more rhythmic, like a code or language. The scratching followed. Then a new sound, a low, continuous hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. My body responded with primal terror, mouth, bone, dry skin, prickling muscles, rigid with the instinct to flee. Around midnight, the motion sensor in the attic triggered. The notification lit up my phone screen where I sat huddled in the corner of my bedroom, as far from the ceiling as possible. With shaking hands, I opened the camera feed. The attic was still dimly visible in the infrared light. Nothing seemed to move, yet the sensor had been triggered. I watched, barely breathing, as the temperature reading in the corner of the screen began to drop rapidly. 40 degrees, 30, 20, impossible cold. Then, in the center of the frame, the dust on the floor began to move, not blown by wind but gathering, swirling upward into a vaguely vertical shape, approximately the size of a person. The feed flickered, distorting as the temperature continued to plummet. My phone screen went black. Simultaneously, the tapping directly above me stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than any sound. I could feel pressure building in the room, as if the air itself were being compressed. Then slowly, the ceiling began to bulge downward. Just a slight curve at first, as if the wood were softening, then more pronounced, stretching like a membrane. I watched paralyzed as a distinct impression formed, fingers pressing down, outlining a hand much larger than any human's. My paralysis broke. I ran tumbling down the stairs across the hall and out the front door. I didn't stop until I reached my car, hands fumbling with the keys, breath coming in ragged gasps. I drove blindly for hours, eventually checking into another anonymous motel as dawn broke there. Sitting on the edge of a sagging bed, I finally confronted the truth I'd been avoiding. I would never sell that house. I would never escape it. Whatever waited in the attic had been waiting for me specifically, perhaps for generations. I realized then that my inheritance wasn't random chance. The house had passed through my family line deliberately, always to the most distant relative, always to someone who wouldn't be missed. I haven't gone back yet, but I know I will. Whatever presence occupies that attic has been patient for decades, perhaps centuries. It can wait a little longer for my return. In my dreams I see the bulging ceiling, the impression of that massive hand reaching down, and beneath the fear, I feel something else, growing a terrible curiosity about what might happen if I reached up to meet it. Sometimes, even here in this motel room 30 m away, I wake at night to the familiar sound, tap, 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 as if it followed me, as if it's letting me know our business remains unfinished, as if it's reminding me that I'll come home soon. The smell hits you first, not overwhelming nothing. You could point to, if someone asked for proof, just the faint lingering trace of cigarette smoke that seems to hover in the air, clinging to the corners of rooms where shadows gather. I noticed it the moment I signed the lease, but the real estate agent assured me it was just my imagination. The previous owner hadn't smoked. She said neither had anyone before him. The building had a strict no-smoking policy, but still that scent persists, appearing suddenly when I'm alone, vanishing when others visit, as if it knows when to hide. I bought this second-floor apartment 3 months ago. Drawn by its reasonable price and the quiet neighborhood, the building itself is unassuming, just 4 floors, 16 units total, with an aging brick exterior that speaks of decades gone by without much renovation. My unit faces east, catching the morning sun through sliding glass doors that lead to a modest balcony overlooking a small courtyard. Everything about it suggested peace, stability, a new beginning after my divorce. The first week passed uneventfully. I unpacked my belongings, arranged furniture, and tried to make the space my own. The smell would come and go strongest in the early evening, around 7 p.m., and almost imperceptible by morning. I bought air fresheners, left windows open, even had the ventilation system checked. Nothing helped. The technician who examined the ducts shrugged and suggested it might be coming from another unit, though he couldn't explain why it would disappear for hours at a time. It was during my second week that I first heard the sound. I was stretched out on my couch halfway through a documentary when a distinct metallic clicking came from the balcony door, the sound of someone manipulating the lock from outside. My heart lurched into my throat as I sat bolt upright, eyes fixed on the handle. It moved down, then up with deliberate precision. I remained frozen for several seconds before forcing myself to approach. The courtyard below was empty. The door remained locked. I checked twice, 3 times, running my fingers along the metal track to confirm no one could have accessed it from outside. My apartment was on the 2nd floor, not impossible to reach, but difficult without equipment that would have been noticed by neighbors. I slept poorly that night, jerking awake at every creak and groan of the building settling. The following morning I approached Miguel, the building superintendent, a man in his 60s with perpetually oil-stained hands and eyes that never quite met mine. I described what I'd heard, asking if there had been any reports of attempted break-ins or if maintenance workers might have been on a ladder near my unit. Miguel's reaction was immediate and strange. His weathered face seemed to drain of color, and he busied himself with adjusting the tool belt around his substantial waist. He muttered something about old buildings making noises, about how the metal contracts at night, how I shouldn't worry. When I pressed him about previous tenants, he abruptly excused himself, claiming an emergency in the basement. I watched him hurry away, his gait uneven, as if eager to put distance between himself and my questions. The nights grew worse. I began hearing footsteps in the hallway between my bedroom and living room light, but deliberate, the unmistakable rhythm of someone pacing back and forth. The first time I leapt from bed, heart hammering against my ribs, mouth dry as paper, I hit the light switch illuminating the empty hallway. Nothing was disturbed. No doors stood open. That should have been closed. I checked every closet behind the shower curtain, under the bed, all the places where childhood fears lurk. Nothing. I installed a security system. The following day, motion sensors, door alarms, cameras covering every angle of my apartment. The technician remarked on my thoroughness, asking if I'd experienced a break-in. I gave a non-committal answer, unwilling to voice my growing paranoia. That night I sat awake, laptop open to the security feeds, watching empty rooms, bathed in the dim blue glow of night vision cameras. At 2:17 a.m., the smoke detector in the hallway began blinking rapidly, though it emitted no sound. Simultaneously, that familiar smell of cigarette smoke intensified, becoming so strong I could almost see it curling through the air. The temperature in the apartment dropped precipitously. I could see my breath fogging before me on the security feed. Nothing changed. Empty hallway, empty living room, empty kitchen. But the footsteps started again directly outside my bedroom door. My body responded before my mind could process what was happening. Pulse racing, skin prickling with cold sweat, muscles tensing to run. Though there was nowhere to go. I watched the door handle, waiting for it to turn. It didn't. Instead, the footsteps moved away toward the living room. On the security feed, nothing appeared. Yet I could hear them clearly moving toward the balcony door. The clicking sound came again, metal against metal, followed by the distinctive sound of the door sliding open. But on my laptop screen the door remained closed. I didn't sleep that night or much of the next week. Work suffered. Colleagues commented on my bloodshot eyes and jumpy demeanor. I began researching the building's history, spending hours at the local library and city records office. The structure dated back to the 1960s, originally built as affordable housing before being converted to condominiums in the early 2000s. Nothing in its history suggested tragedy or the kind of trauma that folklore associates with hauntings. No suspicious deaths, no fires, notorious crimes. Yet the disturbances continued, evolving in subtle ways. The television would turn itself on at random hours, always tuned to static faucets would run cold water in the middle of the night. My clothes would smell of smoke after hanging in the closet as if someone had been wearing them while smoking, and always that feeling of being watched, a pressure between my shoulder blades. When I turned my back to an empty room, I tried contacting the previous owner, a man named Lawrence Whitaker, who had moved to Arizona after selling the apartment. His phone number had been disconnected. An email went unanswered. The real estate agent who handled the sale was similarly unhelpful, citing client confidentiality. When I pressed for details about why Whitaker had moved, it was Mrs. Abernathy 3C who finally offered a clue. An elderly woman with a fondness for oversized cardigans and blunt conversation, she cornered me by the mailboxes one afternoon. She'd noticed my deteriorating appearance, she said, and had a suspicion about its cause. Without waiting for my response, she launched into an account of the apartment's previous occupant, not Lawrence Whitaker, but the tenant before him, a man named Victor Reyes. According to Mrs. Abernathy, Reyes had been a solitary figure who worked nights as a security guard, a heavy smoker. Despite the building's policy, he would sit on his balcony at all hours, cigarette in hand, watching the courtyard below with unsettling intensity. Neighbors had complained about the smoke drifting into their units, about his odd hours and unfriendly demeanor. Then abruptly he stopped appearing. The apartment remained closed up for weeks before the superintendent finally checked on him. Mrs. Abernathy leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She didn't know exactly what Miguel had found inside, but the police had come, followed by people in hazmat suits. The apartment had been gutted afterwards, new flooring, new paint, new fixtures. Whitaker had bought it at a steep discount, she said, but only stayed for 11 months before selling to me that night. As if triggered by this new knowledge, the manifestations intensified. The smoke smell became overwhelming, burning my eyes and throat. The temperature fluctuated wildly, freezing, cold 1 minute, uncomfortably warm. The next, the security system recorded nothing, but I could feel a presence moving through the rooms, circling closer to where I huddled on my bed, back against the headboard, every muscle tense, with the effort of appearing unafraid. Around 3 a.m., something changed. The footsteps stopped directly outside my bedroom. The door, which I had deliberately left open to eliminate hiding places, revealed only darkness. Beyond then, slowly, deliberately, a cigarette ember glowed in that darkness, a floating pinpoint of orange-red that illuminated nothing around it. It brightened with an inhale, dimmed with an exhale, though I saw no smoke. I could smell it filling the room. The rational part of my brain catalogued explanations: hallucination from sleep deprivation, an elaborate prank, carbon monoxide poisoning. But my body recognized a deeper truth. My skin crawled with primitive recognition of something that should not be, something that existed in direct contradiction to the natural order. My lungs struggled against shallow breaths. My heart pounded so violently I feared it might rupture. The ember moved forward into my room, hovering about 5.5 feet off the ground. It stopped at the foot of my bed. The impression of a weight settling onto the mattress followed, not heavy but distinctive. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't process what was happening. Beyond the overwhelming certainty that I was not alone, I must have lost consciousness at some point through fear or exhaustion or some mercy of my overwhelmed mind. When I woke, sunlight streamed through the windows and the apartment was still. No smell of smoke, no strange sounds, just the ordinary silence of morning. I spent that day in a daze, moving mechanically through my routines. While my mind circled back to what I had experienced after work, I found myself driving to the county records office instead of home. I needed answers, something concrete to either validate my experiences or provide an explanation that would allow me to dismiss them. The clerk who helped me seemed accustomed to unusual requests. When I asked about death records for Victor Reyes at my address, she didn't bat an eye, merely typing the information into her computer and waiting for results. None came back. According to official records, no one had died in my apartment. As I turned to leave, the clerk called me back. She checked another database, hospitalization records rather than deaths. Victor Reyes had been admitted to County General 3 years earlier, suffering from severe carbon monoxide poisoning. He'd been found unconscious in his apartment after the building's CO alarms triggered the source, a malfunctioning heating system that had been pumping colorless, odorless gas into his unit for days. He'd survived but sustained significant brain damage from oxygen deprivation. Currently he resided in a long-term care facility on the other side of the state. I drove to my apartment in a state of numb confusion. If Reyes was alive, what was happening in my home? Had the CO leak damaged something in me as well, triggering hallucinations? Was I experiencing some sympathetic psychosis manifesting what I subconsciously feared? The answer came that night. I sat in my living room, lights on, television muted, waiting at exactly 7:00 p.m. The familiar smell of cigarette smoke appeared. This time I didn't panic. I spoke into the empty room, asking aloud if someone was there. Nothing happened for several long minutes. Then slowly the television changed channels by itself, cycling through until it reached a news station. The story being covered showed a fire at a care facility 40 m away. The reporter stood before a building with smoke still rising from its eastern wing, describing how the blaze had started in a patient's room when an illicitly obtained cigarette ignited bedding. The facility was being evacuated. Patients relocated to nearby hospitals. As the camera panned across ambulances and emergency personnel, it briefly showed a gurney being loaded into an ambulance. The patient was covered with a blanket, but his arm hung visible at his side. A hospital bracelet circled his thin wrist, and though the name was not legible on camera, I knew with bone, deep certainty that it read Victor Reyes. The smell of smoke vanished. The television returned to its previous channel. The apartment felt suddenly completely empty in a way it hadn't since I'd moved in. I've researched it extensively since then. theories about traumatic energy imprinting itself on physical locations, studies on consciousness persisting after brain function is compromised, the phenomenon of patients in vegetative states experiencing moments of lucidity or awareness that medical science cannot explain. I still live in the apartment. The manifestations have stopped entirely. No footsteps, no smell of smoke, no clicking at the balcony door. Miguel, the superintendent, finally admitted what he knew when I confronted him with what I'd learned, how Reyes had been a difficult tenant who constantly complained about the heating system before his accident. How the building management had delayed repairs to save money. How guilt had compelled them to keep his incident quiet while renovating his unit to eliminate any trace of what had happened. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself sitting on the balcony looking out at the same view Reyes must have contemplated during his solitary cigarette breaks. I wonder if some part of his consciousness remained here while his body lay elsewhere, trapped between worlds, until circumstances aligned to release him. I wonder if what I experienced was his attempt to communicate, to find justice, or simply to recognize that his suffering had not been entirely forgotten. I don't know if I believe in ghosts. What I do believe is that consciousness is more complex than we understand, that trauma can echo across time and space in ways science has yet to explain. The human mind, damaged, desperate, determined, may be capable of reaching beyond physical limitations when the need is great enough. The apartment is peaceful now, yet sometimes when I'm half asleep, drifting in that liminal space between consciousness and dreams, I catch myself listening for footsteps in the hallway, for the metallic click of the balcony door, not out of fear but from the lingering certainty that we are never truly alone in the spaces we inhabit, that walls and floors and ceilings absorb the experiences that unfold within them, holding them like memories that occasionally surface when the conditions are right. And sometimes, very rarely, I wake to the faint smell of cigarette smoke gone so quickly I can almost believe I imagined it almost the first time I noticed something was wrong. I dismissed it as fatigue. The chisel I'd left on my workbench had somehow migrated to the pegboard across the workshop. A simple mistake. The mind plays tricks when you're exhausted. But by the third time, when my grandfather's antique hand plane appeared balanced precariously on the edge of my table, saw after I'd locked it safely in its drawer, I knew something wasn't right, not in my workshop, not in my sanctuary. My name is Thomas Harrow, and I've been a woodworker for most of my adult life. I inherited my grandfather's tools and his passion for crafting beautiful things from raw lumber. 3 years ago, I converted the old storage shed behind my parents' house into a workshop, a place that became my refuge from the world. The smell of fresh sawdust, the gentle resistance of wood against my hands, the satisfaction of creating something lasting, these sensations ground me, keep me sane in a world that often feels chaotic and meaningless, or at least they used to. My workshop sits about 50 yards from the main house, nestled against a small copse of oak trees that shields it from the neighbor's view. It's not large, 20 by 30 feet, but I've optimized every square in with carefully arranged workbenches, tool storage, and wood racks. The building itself is nothing special, cinder block walls, concrete floor, corrugated metal roof, but I've made it mine, insulating the walls, installing proper lighting, and even adding a small wood stove. For the colder months, I've always preferred working late into the night. There's something about the quiet darkness outside that helps me focus, helps my mind settle into the meditative rhythm of woodworking. My parents' house goes dark around 10 o'clock, and then it's just me, my tools, and whatever project has captured my imagination. The trouble began 6 weeks ago. I was working on a cherrywood dining table for a client, carefully handpling the tabletop to achieve that glass smooth finish that machine sanding can never quite replicate. I had laid out my tools in my usual methodical fashion, measuring tools to the left, cutting tools to the right, finishing tools on the small rolling cart. Everything has its place in my workshop. Everything belongs somewhere specific. I stepped away to heat some water for tea on the hot plate I keep in the corner. It couldn't have been more than 3 minutes when I returned to my bench. My grandfather's prized mortising chisel, a tool I rarely use but keep immaculately maintained out of respect for his memory, had moved from its leather pouch to the center of my workbench. The hot mug nearly slipped from my fingers. I was absolutely certain I hadn't removed that chisel. I hadn't needed it for this project, and I'm religious about only taking out the tools I need. Less clutter means fewer mistakes. I carefully returned the chisel to its pouch, chalking it up to absent-mindedness. Perhaps I'd taken it out earlier and forgotten. Perhaps I'd meant to use it and changed my mind. These things happen, except they don't happen to me, not with my tools. 3 nights later, it was my Japanese pull saw that had somehow migrated from its wall mount to my lumber rack. The night after that, I found my marking gauge sitting precisely in the center of the workshop floor, its brass edge gleaming in the overhead light. I started keeping notes, dates, times, which tools moved, where they ended up looking for patterns. There weren't any obvious ones. It was always tools I hadn't used that day, always tools with some sentimental value. My grandfather's chisel, the hand plane. I'd received as a gift from my father when I sold my first commissioned piece, the marking gauge. I'd saved for months to buy. When I was just starting out, I considered practical explanations. The workshop sits on a slight incline. Perhaps vibrations from my work were causing things to slide, but that didn't explain how tools moved uphill or jumped from closed drawers to open surfaces, a rodent problem. But there were no droppings, no chewed wood, and mice don't typically rearrange human tools. With such apparent deliberation, after 2 weeks of this, I installed a heavy-duty deadbolt on the door and a padlock on the single window. I even set up my phone to record time-lapse video while I worked, hoping to catch something. The videos showed nothing except me moving around the shop and occasional frames where I stepped out of view. During those frames, nothing moved. That shouldn't have. My mother noticed my distraction one morning over breakfast. She asked if I was sleeping enough, mentioned that she'd heard me moving around the workshop at odd hours. I assured her everything was fine. Just a challenging commission with a tight deadline. I didn't tell her that I'd started setting traps, not for animals but for whatever or whoever was toying with me. Talcum powder dusted across the floor, threads stretched invisibly across doorways, a grid of toothpicks arranged in precise patterns that would be disturbed by the slightest movement each morning. I'd find my traps untouched, but a different tool moved. My straight-edge ruler balanced impossibly on its narrow edge. My dovetail saw hanging from the ceiling light fixture. My spoke shave disassembled, its parts arranged in a perfect circle on my workbench. My sleep suffered even on nights when I didn't work. I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining what might be happening in my workshop during the day. I was irritable, jumpy. I snapped at my father when he asked about the progress on the cherry table. I apologized immediately, but the concern in his eyes only deepened. I began staying in the workshop overnight. I brought in an old camping cot and set it up in the corner furthest from the door. I would pretend to leave for the night, making a show of locking up and walking back to the house. Then I'd circle around through the trees using the spare key I kept hidden to slip back inside. I would turn off all the lights and wait in the darkness, sometimes for hours, hardly daring to breathe. Nothing happened during those vigils. No sounds except the normal settling of the building, the occasional scurrying of some small animal outside, the distant hum of traffic from the highway beyond our property. No movement except the slow dance of moonlight and shadow through the window. But each time when I finally gave in to exhaustion and allowed myself to sleep, I would wake to find something changed. The cot moved to the center of the room, my work boots placed neatly on my workbench and, most disturbing of all, that mortising chisel, always that same chisel positioned upright on the floor beside the cot, its sharp edge pointing directly at my face. My work began to suffer. I made careless mistakes, measurements off by fractions of an inch, saw cuts that wandered from the line, glue joints that failed under the slightest pressure. The cherry table was weeks behind schedule and the client was becoming impatient. I told them there had been a family emergency. Bought myself another 2 weeks. In a moment of desperation, I consulted Dr. Reeves, my mother's therapist friend, who sometimes came over for dinner. Without giving too many details, I described my experiences as hypothetical situations, asking how someone might distinguish between actual external events and potential hallucinations. She regarded me with professional concern, suggested that sleep deprivation, stress, or underlying anxiety could manifest in unusual ways. She offered to recommend someone I could talk to more formally. I declined, but her words stayed with me. Was I losing my mind? Was this all some elaborate self-deception, my subconscious acting out in ways I couldn't recognize or control? I began to doubt my own memories, my own perceptions. Had I actually put that chisel away, or had I just thought about doing it? Was I sleepwalking, rearranging my own tools in some bizarre nocturnal ritual? Last week I tried a different approach. Instead of fighting against the phenomenon, I decided to acknowledge it directly, standing in the center of my workshop. Feeling foolish but desperate, I spoke aloud to the empty room. I explained that this was my space, that the constant disruption was affecting my livelihood, that whatever was happening needed to stop. My voice echoed off the cinder block walls, sounding thin and uncertain even to my own ears. That night I found every single tool in my workshop, from the smallest brad nail to my heavy bandsaw, stacked in a precarious tower in the center of the floor, reaching nearly to the ceiling at the very top, balanced on its handle. Was that mortising chisel? It should have been impossible. The tower defied physics, weights and balances arranged in ways that shouldn't have been stable, and the time it would have taken to construct such a thing. Hours of meticulous stacking and balancing far exceeded the 30 minutes I'd been away getting dinner. My hands trembled as I carefully deconstructed the tower, returning each tool to its proper place. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, sweat beaded on my forehead, despite the cool evening air. Every few seconds I would glance over my shoulder, convinced that someone was watching me from the shadows in the corners of the workshop. That was the breaking point. I packed a bag and checked into a motel on the edge of town, telling my parents I needed some space to focus on finishing the cherry table design. For 3 days I didn't go near the workshop. I slept fitfully, dreaming of tools moving on their own, of invisible hands rearranging my carefully ordered world, of that chisel hovering in the air above my sleeping form. On the 4th day I returned. Whatever was happening, this was still my space, my livelihood. I couldn't abandon it. Out of fear, I unlocked the door with shaking hands, half expecting to find chaos inside. Instead, everything was exactly as I had left it, tools in their proper places, the half-finished cherry table waiting patiently on the workbench, no signs of disturbance or intrusion. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps whatever had been happening had run its course. Perhaps my absence had broken the pattern. I worked through the afternoon, finishing the table legs, preparing to attach them to the tabletop. The familiar rhythms of woodworking gradually calmed my frayed nerves. The smooth resistance of the wood against my hands anchored me. In reality, this was tangible. This was real. As dusk fell, I turned on the overhead lights and my bench lamp. I was laying out the mortise and tenon joints. When I heard it, a soft scraping sound from the far corner of the workshop, my blood turned to ice. Slowly I raised my head. Nothing was there, just shadows in the lumber rack in my old tool chest. The sound came again, a deliberate drag of something hard across the concrete floor. I turned fully. Now the marking gauge clutched in my white-knuckled grip. Still nothing visible. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, barely audible even to myself. The scraping stopped. Then, from directly behind me, the unmistakable sound of metal tapping against wood. Once, twice, 3 times I spun around so quickly I nearly lost my balance. My workbench was empty, except for the cherry tabletop and the tools I'd been using. No one was there, nothing had moved. But there, in the surface of the cherrywood, 3 fresh indentations that hadn't been there moments before, perfect little triangular impressions, the exact shape and size that would be made by the tip of my grandfather's mortising chisel. My heart hammered against my ribs. My mouth went dry. I backed away from the workbench until I hit the wall, my eyes darting frantically around the workshop. "What do you want?" I whispered to the empty room. For several long minutes nothing happened. The only sounds were my ragged breathing and the distant hoot of an owl outside. Then, as I watched, paralyzed with fear and fascination, my grandfather's chisel slid slowly out from underneath the cherry tabletop. It moved with deliberate purpose, as if held by invisible fingers, and positioned itself upright on the workbench. A message began to appear in the surface of the tabletop, shallow cuts forming letters, the chisel moving on its own, carving into the wood I had so carefully prepared. "Not your tools." The chisel paused, hovering an inch above the wood. Then it continued, "Never yours." I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to get as far away from this workshop as possible. but some combination of terror and morbid curiosity kept me rooted to the spot as the chisel carved a final line. He promised them to me. First, the chisel dropped flat onto the workbench with a dull thud. In the sudden silence, my racing thought slowly crystallized around a memory long forgotten. My grandfather on his deathbed, gripping my hand with surprising strength, whispering that his tools would go to the boys, not boys. I had always assumed he was confused, mixing me up with my father perhaps, but my father had never shown any interest in woodworking. There had been another, though a name rarely mentioned in family gatherings, my father's brother, estranged for decades after some ancient unspoken betrayal, an uncle who, according to the few stories I'd heard, had apprenticed with my grandfather before disappearing from our family's life. An uncle who had died just 2 months before these disturbances began. I stayed in the workshop until dawn, seated on the floor, with my back against the wall, watching the chisel that remained motionless on the workbench. As the first grey light filtered through the window, I made a decision. I gathered all of my grandfather's tools, the chisel, the hand plane, the marking gauge and a dozen others, and packed them carefully in their original wooden chest. That afternoon I drove to the cemetery on the edge of town, to a fresh grave in the southwest corner. I knew from the obituary page that he had been buried there, this uncle. I had never met this man, who had shared my grandfather's blood and his passion for woodworking. I left the chest beside the simple headstone. "These were meant for you," I said to the silent grave. "I didn't know they're yours now." Since that day my workshop has been quiet. My tools stay where I place them. My work has improved, the cherry table finally completed and delivered to a satisfied client. Sometimes late at night, I imagine, I hear a faint tapping from the direction of the cemetery, the sound of a master craftsman working with the tools that were always, rightfully, his. But in my workshop in my sanctuary, there is only the comforting rhythm of my own hands, shaping wood into something beautiful and lasting. The peace has returned most nights anyway, because sometimes, when I'm about to close up for the evening, I could swear. I see something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that doesn't match my movements, a reflection in the window that isn't quite my own, and sometimes, though I'm sure I'm imagining it, I feel a presence nearby, watching my technique with a critical eye, a craftsman's eye judging whether I'm worthy of the space I've claimed. On those nights, I leave a small offering on the workbench, a perfect wood shaving, curled like a question mark or a complex joint executed with precision, a tribute to the skills passed down through my family's blood, a reminder that some passions transcend even death, and the offerings are always gone by morning. The first sign something was wrong came not as a thunderclap of realization, but as an insidious whisper of doubt. That subtle, persistent creak above my head, not quite rhythmic enough to be mechanical, not quite random enough to be the building settling it, scratched at the edge of my consciousness like a cat pouring to be let in from the cold. I should have recognized the warning then, but exhaustion and practicality overruled the primitive part of my brain, frantically waving red flags. I travel for my consulting business at least twice a month, and economy dictates my accommodations are rarely luxurious. The Oakwood Inn was just another forgettable waypoint, a 3-story converted Victorian home on the outskirts of Millfield, population for 371, the kind of place with faded floral wallpaper and a lobby that smelled faintly of potpourri and disuse. Most importantly, it was only 15 minutes from the manufacturing plant where I'd be spending the next 3 days evaluating their outdated inventory system. My room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a narrow hallway with worn burgundy carpet and wall sconces that cast more shadows than Lightroom 312, not especially spacious but adequate. A queen bed with a sagging middle, a desk with a lamp missing its final, a television at least a decade old and a threadbare armchair positioned in the corner facing the window. The bathroom was clean, if dated, with rust stains around the drain that no amount of scrubbing would remove. That first evening I unpacked, reviewed my presentation for the next morning and fell into bed around 10 o'clock, bone-tired from the 6-hour drive. The ceiling creak began shortly after a faint, intermittent sound, like someone taking a single step, pausing then another, not directly overhead but slightly offset, toward the bathroom. I assumed it was another guest pacing in the room above. Only later did I remember the clerk mentioning I was on the top floor. I drifted off despite the noise but woke suddenly at 11:17 p.m. According to the harsh red numbers on the bedside clock, the creaking had stopped. In its place came a soft, persistent hissing from somewhere outside my door. Static electricity, I thought, groggy, or perhaps an old radiator. The sound wavered in intensity, rising then falling, almost like breathing, but with the unmistakable quality of radio between stations. Sleep-addled and irritated, I dragged myself from bed and shuffled to the door, intent on finding the source. The hallway was empty and dimly lit. The sconces turned to their lowest setting for the night. The static sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the corridor with white noise that prickled the hairs on my arms. I checked both directions, nothing but closed doors and silent carpet, no radios, no electronic equipment, no maintenance closet where machinery might hum. As I reached for my door, knob goose flesh rippled across my shoulders. The static had changed tenor, slightly, becoming higher pitched, almost like a distant, distorted voice trying to speak through the hiss. I hurried back inside, locked the door and told myself it was just the building's old electrical system misbehaving. The next day was consumed with meetings, flowcharts, and the tedium of database migration planning. I pushed the strange noises from my mind, attributing them to unfamiliar surroundings and pre-presentation nerves. When I returned to the Oakwood that evening, I asked the elderly desk clerk about potential electrical issues. She peered at me through thick bifocals and insisted the wiring had been completely updated just 5 years ago. When I mentioned the creaking ceiling, she shrugged and suggested it was just the building talking to itself, as old structures are wont to do. Determined to sleep better, I brought back earplugs from a drugstore and inserted them before climbing into bed. They dulled the ceiling creaks that had predictably returned but couldn't completely eliminate them. It wasn't until after 11 p.m. that I realized the earplugs were useless against the static. If anything, they seemed to amplify it. As though the sound bypassed my ears entirely and vibrated directly against my eardrums from the inside. I yanked them out and sat up, heart pounding. The static was definitely louder tonight and closer, no longer confined to the hallway but seeping under my door like invisible smoke. I buried my head under the pillow, but the sound persisted, seeming to fill the room with its electric hiss. At some point I must have fallen asleep despite the noise, because I woke with a violent start. At 3:07 a.m. The room was pitch black, except for the clock's crimson glow. The static had changed. It now came unmistakably from the corner of the room where the armchair sat facing the window. My throat constricted as I stared into the darkness, unable to discern the chair's outline, but absolutely certain something was there. I fumbled for the bedside lamp, my fingers clumsy with sleep and growing dread. When the light clicked on, the chair appeared empty. The static softened but didn't disappear entirely, retreating to a barely perceptible whisper. Sleep eluded me for the remainder of the night. I sat propped against the headboard, keeping the light on and my eyes fixed on that empty chair until dawn filtered through the thin curtains. During my second day at the plant, fatigue made concentration nearly impossible. I drank coffee by the gallon and made careless errors in my assessment that required backtracking and apologies. When my client suggested I looked unwell and perhaps needed rest, I found myself explaining about the strange noises at the hotel. Saying it aloud made it sound ridiculous, a grown man disturbed by ceiling creaks and static. The client, a local man in his 60s named Richard, didn't laugh as I expected. Instead, his weathered face grew solemn as he asked which hotel I was staying in. When I mentioned the Oakwood, a look passed between him and his assistant that made my stomach tighten. Richard suggested, in a casual tone that felt rehearsed, that perhaps I'd be more comfortable at the Holiday Inn Express on the highway. The company would be happy to cover the change in accommodation. I declined, partly out of stubbornness and partly because moving seemed an overreaction to what were likely mundane noises. He didn't press the issue, but as I was leaving, he mentioned, as though it were an afterthought, that the Oakwood had originally been a sanatorium in the early 1900s, before being converted to a private residence and eventually a hotel. He advised me to get more rest and left me with a strange parting comment. Some places remember what happened in them. That night I returned to the Oakwood with a mixture of defiance and apprehension. I'd purchased noise-cancelling headphones during my lunch break, expensive ones that promised complete auditory isolation. I also brought back a small desk fan, thinking perhaps the air circulation would help with the strange cold spot I'd noticed. I set up the fan facing the corner where the armchair sat as it oscillated. The curtains billowed gently, but when the airflow passed over the chair, the fabric appeared to pause in its movement as though striking an invisible obstacle. I told myself it was just the angle of the air current. The ceiling creaks began earlier this time, starting around 9. They were more insistent, no longer just isolated pops and groans, but a deliberate pattern. 3 creaks pause, 2 creaks pause, 3 creaks. Again, my brain kept trying to assign meaning to the sequence, a warning, a greeting. I shook my head at the absurdity of the thought. I put on the headphones around 10 o'clock, queued up an audiobook and determinedly closed my eyes. For a while it worked. The narrator's voice drowned out any ambient sounds and I felt myself drifting towards sleep. Then the static began, not in my ears but in my head. Somehow it cut through the narration, intertwining with the words until they became unintelligible. I increased the volume to maximum, but the static rose to match it. I yanked off the headphones and the room fell silent for exactly 3 seconds before the static erupted again loudly, unmistakably from the armchair in the corner. My body went rigid with primal fear. The darkness around the chair seemed deeper than elsewhere in the room, as though light itself was being consumed there. The static fluctuated in a pattern that horrifyingly resembled speech rising and falling in cadences that my brain strained to interpret. Swallowing hard against the dryness in my throat, I forced myself to swing my legs over the edge of the bed. My heart hammered so violently I could feel it in my fingertips. With trembling hands, I reached for the lamp switch, irrationally certain that something would grab my wrist before I could touch it. Light flooded the room. The static diminished but didn't disappear completely. The armchair appeared empty, yet somehow wrong. The indentation in the cushion suggested weight. Where there was none, the fan continued to oscillate, but every time it blew in the direction of the chair, the airflow seemed to divert around an invisible presence. I stood on unsteady legs, my breath coming in shallow gasps that didn't seem to provide enough oxygen. Something compelled me forward, not courage, but a desperate need to prove to myself that my mind was playing tricks, that there was a rational explanation. 3 steps from the chair I hit a wall of cold, so intense it stole my breath, not the generalized chill of an air conditioner, but a concentrated pocket of frigid air, exactly the size and shape of a seated person. The static grew louder as I extended my hand toward the seemingly empty space. My fingertips penetrated the cold barrier and touched nothing tangible, yet definitely something, a resistance like pushing through gelatin accompanied by a jolt of pins and needles that shot up my arm. The static screamed in my ears, modulating into a garbled sound that might have been words spoken underwater or played backward. I recoiled, stumbling back to the bed, my heart racing so fast I thought it might rupture. The cold spot remained in the chair, but the static subsided to a low, steady hiss that sounded almost like measured breathing. Sleep was unthinkable. I sat with my back pressed against the headboard, keeping the lamp lit and my eyes fixed on the chair until sunrise. Occasionally the ceiling would creak in that same pattern. 3, pause 2, pause 3, and each time the static would briefly intensify in response. When morning finally came, I packed my bags with shaking hands and checked out a day early, fabricating a family emergency to explain my premature departure. The elderly clerk didn't seem surprised or concerned, simply nodding and printing my receipt without comment. I called my client from the car and apologized for the inconvenience, explaining I'd need to complete the final assessment remotely. Richard expressed understanding, but no surprise. As our call was ending, I found myself asking if he knew anything more about the history of the Oakwood, specifically room 312. There was a long pause before he responded. Room 312, he explained, reluctantly, had once been an isolation room in the old sanatorium used for patients with severe psychiatric conditions. One particular patient had spent years there, a man who believed radio waves carried messages directly to his brain. He died in that room, not violently, Richard hastened to add, but alone. And still convinced, the static held voices trying to communicate with him. I ended the call and drove with the radio volume at maximum, trying to drown out both the memory of that static and the lingering sensation of cold resistance against my fingertips. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake in the darkest hour of night to the faint sound of static coming from an empty corner of my bedroom, followed by 3 creaks in the ceiling above, then 2, then 3. I've started leaving the radio on. When I sleep, I tell myself it's to mask the ordinary noises of my apartment building, but sometimes, in the white noise between stations, I catch what sounds like words struggling to form, and I wonder if the patient from room 312 might have been right after all. The darkness at Mike's cabin wasn't like city darkness here. It was absolute, a thick smothering blanket that devoured the weak beam of my flashlight. I'd been awake for nearly an hour listening to something scratch against the wooden walls, tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, like fingernails testing the barrier between us. The rational part of my brain suggested branches in the wind, but rationality feels paper thin at 3 a.m. when you're miles from civilization, especially after what happened the night before I came to this forgotten patch of land seeking peace. What I found instead was an escalating nightmare that has me questioning not just my safety but my sanity. The trip had seemed perfect at first. My friend Mike had offered his family's old fishing cabin. After hearing about my burnout at work, nobody's been there for weeks, he told me, just you. The lake and silence, the prospect of 3 days without emails, calls, or the constant digital intrusion of modern life sounded like exactly what I needed. The drive took 4 hours, the last 30 minutes. On a dirt road that twisted through dense pine forest, my SUV bounced over ruts and potholes, branches scraping against the windows like warning fingers. I arrived as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. It was smaller than I'd imagined, a simple wooden structure with a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The weathered grey boards had absorbed decades of rain and snow, giving the place a permanent dampness that I could smell even before opening the door. Inside was basic. A main room with a kitchenette, a worn couch, a fireplace, and a small bedroom off to the side Mike had mentioned. The bathroom was an outhouse about 20 yards behind the cabin. I unloaded my gear quickly as darkness fell, the temperature dropping with the sun. There was a primal satisfaction in lighting the wood stove, its warmth gradually pushing back against the chill. After a simple dinner of canned stew heated on the ancient propane stove, I settled on the couch with a book and a glass of whiskey, listening to the sounds of the forest. Settling into night. The silence was profound, no distant traffic, no hum of electronics, not even the white noise of civilization that forms the backdrop to our lives, just the occasional crack of the fire and the whisper of wind through the pines. I checked my phone out of habit. No signal, as Mike had warned. The screen's glow seemed alien in that rustic space, so I turned it off and slipped it into my bag. Sleep came easily after the long drive. The couch was surprisingly comfortable and the rhythm of my breathing synchronized with the gentle sounds of the forest. I don't know how long I slept before my bladder woke me insistent and uncomfortable. The fire had died to embers, leaving the cabin in near total darkness. My watch showed 2:17 a.m. I fumbled for my flashlight. Reluctant to leave the warm cocoon of my sleeping bag, the beam caught dust motes floating in the air as I oriented myself. The thought of the outhouse, 20 yards across cold, dark ground, was deeply unappealing but necessary. I slipped my feet into my hiking boots without bothering to lace them, grabbed my jacket and steeled myself for the cold. The night air hit me like a physical blow. As I opened the door, my breath clouded in front of me, illuminated by the weak beam of my flashlight. The sky above was magnificent, a canvas of stars undiminished by light pollution, the Milky Way, a smoky ribbon across the blackness. In another context, I might have stood there in awe, but my full bladder and the penetrating cold hurried me along. I had taken no more than 3 steps from the porch. When I heard it, Thomas, my name spoken so clearly and closely that I could feel the breath of it on my ear. I froze, heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. The voice was male, unfamiliar with a strange, lilting quality. I whipped around flashlight beams, slashing through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the cabin wall and empty porch. "Hello." My voice sounded thin and uncertain in the vast silence. "Is someone there?" No response, just the soft sigh of wind through the trees, which suddenly seemed less like wind and more like distant whispering. I swept the flashlight in a full circle, its beam inadequate, against the wall of darkness surrounding me. Nothing but trees, shadows, and the small wooden outhouse. In the distance, my scalp prickled with a primal fear that bypassed all rational thought. I hurried to the outhouse, no longer feeling the cold eyes darting in every direction inside the small structure. I latched the door with shaking hands, suddenly grateful for the enclosed space, despite its musty smell. I finished my business quickly, fighting the irrational fear that something was just outside waiting. The return to the cabin was a barely controlled sprint. I slammed the door behind me, threw the bolt and stood there panting, adrenaline coursing through my system. In the relative safety of the cabin, doubt began creeping in. Had I actually heard someone call my name? Or was it just the wind playing tricks? My sleep-addled brain, interpreting random sounds as something familiar. I rebuilt the fire with trembling hands, its warm light doing little to dispel my unease. Sleep seemed impossible now, but eventually exhaustion overcame fear and I drifted into uneasy dreams filled with whispering voices and dark forests. Morning arrived with merciful brightness, washing away the terrors of the night. In daylight, the cabin was charming rather than corroding the surrounding forest, peaceful rather than menacing. I made strong coffee and stepped onto the porch, inhaling the clean, pine-scented air. Birds called from the trees and sunlight dappled the ground through the branches. I almost laughed at my midnight fears, almost because there, circling the cabin in the soft dirt, were footprints, men's dress shoes. By the look of them formal, with a distinctive heel pattern, they formed a complete circuit around the structure, passing directly beneath each window, including the bedroom where I'd nearly slept. Some areas showed the same prints, overlapping multiple times as if someone had stood in place for a long time. Watching my own tracks from the night before were clearly visible, the clumsy, half-dragged marks of my unlaced hiking boots leading to and from the outhouse. But these other prints weren't mine, couldn't be mine. I followed them, heart rate accelerating again. They emerged from the forest. On the eastern side of the clearing, circled the cabin completely, then returned to the woods. In the same place they'd appeared. I stepped into the tree and, seeing how they continued along a barely visible path before disappearing into thicker undergrowth. Disturbed, I returned to the cabin and called Mike on the satellite phone he'd lent me. It took several attempts to connect. When he finally answered, his voice crackled with static. I described the footprints, careful to keep my tone casual, not wanting to sound paranoid. Mike's response was immediate and unequivocal. No one should be anywhere near the cabin. The property was private, far from hiking trails or public land. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles away, an elderly man who rarely left his house. Mike himself hadn't been to the cabin in over a month, and he was certain no one in his family had visited either. The conversation left me more unsettled than reassured. Mike suggested I come back to the city if I was worried, but something in me resisted. It seemed absurd to abandon my weekend over footprints that probably had a logical explanation. Perhaps a forest ranger or a lost hiker had stumbled upon the cabin while I slept. The voice. That had to be my imagination. I spent the day fishing on the small lake behind the property, catching and releasing several decent-sized bays. The physical activity and sunshine worked their magic, and by late afternoon I'd nearly convinced myself that my fears were overblown. I cooked a satisfying meal of fresh fish over the fire pit outside, watching the sun sink behind the trees as darkness began to fall. However, I felt the first stirrings of anxiety returning like an incoming tide. I brought in extra firewood, checked and rechecked the door lock, and positioned my sleeping bag so I could see both the door and the window. I placed a heavy cooking pot and my fishing knife within easy reach. These precautions made me feel simultaneously safer and more foolish still. I left the fire burning brighter than necessary, its light pushing the shadows to the corners of the room. Sleep was elusive. Every sound from the forest, every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves jolted me to alertness. The digital display of my watch counted off the hours: 11:47, 12:23, 1:15. At some point, exhaustion must have overcome vigilance, because I woke suddenly to complete darkness. The fire had died and the cabin was cold. Something had woken me. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear past the thunder of my own heartbeat. There it was again, a soft, deliberate tap on the window. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. I reached for the flashlight with a trembling hand but hesitated before turning it on. The darkness felt like a thin protection, as if illuminating the room would somehow invite whatever was outside to see me more clearly. The tapping continued, moving now from the window to the wall beside my bed. Tap, tap, pause. Like a visitor requesting entry, my mouth had gone desert, dry. My muscles locked in the paralysis of extreme fear. The tapping circled the room following the exterior wall, eventually reaching the door. There it stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own ragged breathing too loud. In the stillness, the doorknob turned slowly, the metal scraping against the lock that held it shut. Relief flooded through me at this evidence that the barrier would hold. Then came the voice again, closer and clearer than before. "Thomas, I know you're awake." A whimper escaped my throat before I could suppress it. The voice was wrong, somehow hollow yet intimate, like a whisper directly into my ear, despite coming from outside the door. "Let me in." "Thomas, it's cold out here." "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" No answer came. Just another slow, deliberate attempt at the doorknob. I fumbled for my phone, its screen glaring painfully bright in the darkness, still no signal. Of course. The satellite phone was in my bag across the room near the door. To reach it, I would have to move closer to whatever was on the other side. I sat frozen, listening to the intermittent attempts at the door, each rattling of the knob sending fresh waves of terror through me. This continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then abruptly it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I strained to hear any indication of where the visitor had gone. Had they left or merely moved to another position around the cabin? I clutched the fishing knife, its solid weight in my hand, providing minimal comfort. Dawn arrived with excruciating slowness, as the first grey light filtered through the windows. I finally dared to move muscles stiff from hours of tensed immobility. The cabin was empty, just as it had been. I approached the door cautiously, knife still in hand, and inspected the lock. It was intact, showing no signs of tampering. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and eased it open a crack. The porch was empty. I stepped outside, knife still ready, and surveyed the clearing morning. Mist hung between the trees, giving the forest an ethereal quality. Birds were beginning their day with tentative calls. Everything appeared normal, peaceful. Even then I looked down fresh footprints in the damp earth. The same dress shoe pattern as before, but this time they didn't just circle the cabin. They formed a path that led directly to and from each window, with areas of deeper impression where someone had stood for extended periods watching at the door. The prints were the deepest of all, as if their owner had spent most of the night standing there waiting for entry. I followed the tracks with my eyes. This time they didn't retreat into the forest but led toward the lake instead. Against all better judgment, I followed them. Knife gripped tightly. The trail wound through morning wet grass to the small dock where I'd fished the day before there. The footprints simply ended at the water's edge. I stood staring at the lake's placid surface, its morning stillness reflecting the sky and surrounding trees like a perfect mirror. It revealed nothing of what might lie beneath a decision crystallized in my mind. I hurried back to the cabin, threw my belongings haphazardly into my bag and was in my car within 15 minutes. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. For an instant I thought I saw a figure standing at the bedroom window, a dark silhouette watching my departure. I blinked and it was gone. Just a trick of light and shadow, I told myself, pressing hard on the accelerator. The satellite phone rang as I reached the main road. It was Mike asking if I'd enjoyed my stay. I couldn't bring myself to describe the night's events, settling instead for vague responses about needing to get back for work. How could I explain what had happened without sounding deranged? Even now, racing back toward civilization, doubt was creeping in. Had it all been my imagination? Stress-induced hallucinations brought on by isolation. But as the cabin disappeared behind me, I realized with sudden, chilling clarity that I had never told Mike my schedule never mentioned. I would be leaving today rather than tomorrow. So why had he called at the exact moment I was leaving, as if something had informed him that his property was now vacant? I never returned to Mike's cabin and our friendship has cooled. In the months since he occasionally asks if I want to use the place again, mentioning that it misses me, I always declined, politely making excuses about being too busy. I haven't told him that I sometimes wake in the night to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window, tap, tap, pause, or that occasionally, in crowds or empty hallways, I hear someone whisper my name with that same lilting quality too close to my ear. And I certainly haven't told him about the wet footprints I sometimes find on my bathroom floor in the morning, men's dress shoes, distinctive heel pattern leading nowhere. The fluorescent lights in the storeroom flicker in that particular way. That makes everything feel wrong, like watching reality through a strobe light, each flash revealing something that wasn't there before. I've worked at Pearson's Market for 3 years and I still can't shake the feeling that this place changes. When no one's looking tonight as I make my final rounds, that sensation crawls up my spine with icy fingers. Something about the shadows stretches too far, bends at impossible angles. The rational part of my brain insists it's just fatigue playing tricks. But deep down I know better. This market has secrets and they're beginning to reveal themselves to me, whether I want them to or not. My closing routine never used to bother me. Lock the front doors, count the register, check the storage room, set the alarm, leave through the back, simple. But over the past few months things have changed. It started with small inconsistencies. Inventory I swore I'd organized one way, appearing rearranged the next day. When I mentioned it to my manager, Paul, he shrugged it off. Maybe the morning crew moved things around. Maybe I was remembering wrong. Maybe. But the morning crew denied touching anything, and I've been doing this job long enough to know my own work. I switch on the storage room lights and immediately noticed the cardboard boxes of canned goods. Yesterday I'd stacked them in neat columns of 3 against the east wall. Now they form a scattered arrangement, some laid flat, others balanced precariously on their corners. A shiver runs up my arms as I survey the room. The security system shows no breaches, and I'm the only one with keys to this part of the building. After hours I force myself to take a deep breath, trying to slow my racing heart. The silence presses against my eardrums like cotton wool, making every small sound, the hum of the refrigeration units, the tick of the old analog clock on the wall, seem unnaturally loud. I begin to rearrange the boxes, cursing under my breath. Cold sweat beads on my forehead. Despite the chill of the room, my fingers leave damp prints on the cardboard. As I work I can't shake the feeling of being watched. The corner of my eye keeps catching movement that disappears. When I turn my head, just shadows. I tell myself just the flickering lights playing tricks. It wasn't always this bad. For the first 2 years working here, the place was just a job, boring, predictable, safe. The change came gradually, almost too subtle to notice at first a pen. That wasn't where I left it. The break room chair pushed slightly away from the table, the faint smell of something musty and ancient when I opened the supply closet. Paul thinks I'm losing it. He didn't say it outright, but I could see it in his eyes when I showed him how the cleaning supplies had been rearranged for the 5th time in 2 weeks. He suggested I see someone get some help, said the stress of night shifts can get to anyone. But I'm not imagining the low scraping sounds that sometimes echo from the storeroom when I'm alone at the front of the store. I'm not imagining the footsteps that stop whenever I try to track them down. Last week I left a trap, nothing elaborate, just a thin line of talcum powder along the threshold of the storeroom door. When I returned from my break, the powder was disturbed not by footprints but by something that seemed to have been dragged through it, leaving strange, undulating patterns in its wake. My stomach clenched so tight I thought I might vomit right there. Tonight feels different, worse. The air in the market seems thicker, somehow resistant, as if I'm moving through invisible cobwebs. My skin prickles continuously, tiny electrical shocks that dance across my flesh at random intervals. The usual sounds of the building settling seem more deliberate, more purposeful, less like a structure adjusting to temperature changes and more like something large shifting its weight. I check my watch, 11:42 p.m., 18 minutes, and I can leave, go home. Pretend this is all in my head. I just need to finish the inventory check and lock up. But as I move toward the storage room, dread pools in my stomach like ice water. My legs feel lean, my mouth goes desert, dry. The storage room door stands slightly ajar, though I distinctly remember closing it earlier. A thin ribbon of darkness stretches from the gap, somehow blacker than the surrounding shadows. It seems to pulse, to breathe. My rational mind races for explanations: a draft, a problem with the lights inside. But my instincts scream danger. With trembling fingers, I reach for my phone and turn on the flashlight. The beam seems feeble against the darkness leaking from the storeroom. I push the door open wider, wincing at the low creak of the hinges. The sound seems to stretch, lasting longer than it should. "Hello," my voice emerges as a hoarse whisper. No response, not that I expected one. I step inside, sweeping the light across the room. Everything looks normal at first: shelves of stock, cleaning supplies, the old desk with the inventory logbook. But then I noticed the back wall. The heavy metal shelving unit that normally stands flush against it has been moved, dragged about a foot to the left. It weighs at least 300 pounds. I couldn't move it alone without making an enormous racket. As I approach the shelving unit, my flashlight beam catches something on the exposed section of wall. At first I think it's graffiti or water damage, but as I draw closer my breath catches in my throat. It's writing, or something like writing symbols I've never seen before, etched directly into the drywall. They seem to shimmer slightly, as if viewed through heat waves rising from hot asphalt. Looking at them makes my eyes water and my head throb. A sound behind me, the soft scuff of something against concrete. I whirl around, heart hammering against my ribs so hard. It hurts nothing, just boxes and shelves and shadows. But one shadow seems wrong. It stretches from behind a stack of paper towels, too long, too angular to match the object casting it. And as I stare, it seems to lengthen to reach toward me with tapering fingers. I blink hard, and when I open my eyes, the shadow looks normal again. Just my imagination. Just stress and fatigue, and too many late nights alone in this place. I turn back to the strange markings on the wall, determined to photograph them as proof for Paul, for anyone who might believe me. But my phone screen shows nothing but blank wall where I know the symbols are etched. I look up from the screen and they're still there, still shimmering, still making my temples pound with increasing intensity. I try again with the camera, nothing, as if the symbols exist only for my eyes. The temperature in the room plummets. Suddenly my breath clouds in front of my face. The shelves begin to vibrate, items rattling against each other in a discordant percussion that grows louder by the second. The symbols on the wall pulse in rhythm, with the noise, their edges bleeding, spreading across the surface like spilled ink. I need to leave now. Every cell in my body screams it, but as I turn toward the door I see it's closed again. I never closed it. The handle turns in my sweating palm, but the door doesn't budge. Locked from the outside, something cold touches the back of my neck. Not a solid touch, but the suggestion of contact, like fingers of mist. My muscles lock up. I can't move, can't scream, can barely breathe through the constriction of terror gripping my throat. The presence behind me doesn't move away. Instead I feel it leaning closer, sense its weight hovering just behind my right ear. The air there feels charged, dense, with malevolent intent. A whisper so soft I almost miss it beneath the rattle of the shelves. My name spoken in a voice like stones grinding together, not a human voice, not even close. The paralysis breaks, I lunge for the door, slamming my shoulder against it with enough force to send pain shooting down my arm. It gives way, suddenly sending me sprawling into the hallway. I don't look back. I run, legs pumping, lungs burning. Keys clutched so tightly in my hand that they cut into my palm. The front doors, the alarm, I can't remember the sequence, fumble, with the keys dropping them twice before managing to hit the right combination. Alarms blare as I burst into the parking lot. But I don't care. I'll deal with the security company later. I'll deal with Paul later. All that matters is getting away in my car, engine roaring to life. I finally dare to look back at the market. Through the front windows I can see all the way to the storeroom hallway. A figure stands there, too tall, too thin. Its proportions subtly wrong in ways my mind can't quite process. It raises a hand, at least I think it's a hand, and presses it against the glass of the storeroom door. The glass frosts over instantly, crystals spreading in fractal patterns that formed just for a moment, those same incomprehensible symbols from the wall. I haven't been back to Pearson's Market since that night 3 weeks ago. I called in sick for a week, then finally quit over the phone. Paul sounded concerned, asked if I was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe I am. Maybe that would be the simplest explanation, but I know what I saw and I know what happened next. 2 days after I quit, there was a small article in the local paper. Unusual structural damage discovered at Pearson's Market. Engineers, baffled by apparent subsidence affecting only the storage area. The floor had collapsed partially, revealing something underneath not part of the building's foundation, but something older, much older. Excavation halted when 2 workers were hospitalized with unexplained symptoms, high fever, hallucinations, strange markings appearing on their skin that doctors couldn't identify or treat. The market closed temporarily for repairs. Yellow tape surrounds the building. Now the windows are boarded up. At night, I sometimes drive past parking across the street to watch. No one goes in or out, but sometimes I see lights moving inside, not flashlights or construction lamps, but faint phosphorescent glows that drift past the boards like luminous fog. I know I should move away, find another job in another town, but something keeps me here like a fish hooked through the gut. I dream of those symbols. Now, some nights I wake to find my fingers tracing them on the sheets, on the walls, on my own skin, and sometimes when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear something heavy being dragged across the floor in the empty room next door. I know now that whatever was in that storeroom wasn't confined to it. It noticed me noticing it, and now I think it's following me home. The worst part isn't the fear, it's the growing certainty that soon, very soon, I'll understand what those symbols mean, and when that happens I won't be myself anymore. I catch myself listening for that scraping sound with something close to anticipation. The first time I heard the footsteps I convinced myself it was the building settling. Old structures make noise, they breathe, they creak, they remember. But buildings don't rearrange inventory when you're not looking. Buildings don't unlock doors you've secured yourself, and buildings certainly don't leave strange patterns of merchandise in perfect circles on cold concrete floors. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for the past 3 weeks I've been managing Harlan's Curiosities and Sundries, a cramped variety store wedged between a permanently closed barbershop and a vintage clothing boutique that only opens on weekends. Harlan Pierce, the owner, was an acquaintance from my college days, who reached out unexpectedly after 15 years. His mother in Arizona had fallen ill, he explained, and he needed someone trustworthy to mind the store during his absence. The timing seemed providential. I had just been laid off from my marketing position at a firm that decided to restructure with rent due and savings dwindling. I agreed without hesitation. Harlan gave me a pre-functor tour of the place, a narrow storefront with tall wooden shelves stocked with an eclectic mix of items, vintage postcards, locally made candles, antique trinkets, practical household items, and various other oddities that seemed to follow no particular merchandising logic. The store occupied the ground floor of a 3-story brownstone built in 1893. According to the plaque beside the entrance, the historic downtown district was picturesque during daylight hours but emptied quickly after 6 p.m. when the offices closed and the few restaurants shut their doors. The stock room is through here, Harlan had said, leading me to a heavy wooden door behind the counter. Keep it locked always. His tone had been casual, but his eyes had lingered on mine a beat too long. I'd nodded, attributing his emphasis to normal security concerns. The storeroom was surprisingly large, stretching the entire width of the building and extending back further than seemed possible from the street view. Metal shelving units created narrow corridors stacked with cardboard boxes, many yellowed with age. The air felt different back there, heavier, with an underlying metallic tang that made my sinuses sting. Harlan had shown me a rudimentary inventory system on an ancient desktop computer, handed over the keys and departed the next morning. The first week passed uneventfully. Business was steady but never busy. Elderly locals comprised most of the clientele, purchasing practical items like light bulbs or batteries. Occasionally, tourists wandered in. Drawn by the quaint exterior and the promise of local curiosities, I spent idle hours reorganizing displays and familiarizing myself with the confounding inventory system. It was during the second week that I began staying later, taking advantage of the quiet evenings to conduct a proper inventory. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday night. I was counting stock in the front when I distinctly heard footsteps from the storeroom, deliberate and unhurried, the sound of hard-soled shoes on concrete. My body tensed immediately, heart accelerating, as I called out, asking if someone was there. Silence answered. I approached the storeroom door, finding it securely locked. As I had left it using the key from the ring Harland had given me, I opened it cautiously, flicking on the harsh fluorescent lights. Nothing seemed disturbed. I searched each cramped aisle between the shelving units, finding no one. The rear exit remained bolted from the inside, a layer of undisturbed dust on its threshold. Eventually I convinced myself I'd heard the building settling, or perhaps pipes knocking in the walls. 2 nights later I was updating the inventory spreadsheet. When the computer screen flickered, the overhead lights dimmed momentarily, and in that brief semi-darkness I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time accompanied by a soft scraping sound like cardboard being dragged across concrete. The hair on my arm stood on end as I listened, paralyzed by the unnatural precision of the sound. It continued for exactly 12 steps before stopping abruptly. My mouth had gone desert dry as I forced myself to investigate this time. When I approached the storeroom door, I discovered it unlocked. I was certain, absolutely certain I had locked it earlier. The realization sent a cold sweat breaking across my forehead, my fingers trembling slightly as I pushed the door open. At first glance everything appeared normal, but as I ventured deeper into the storeroom, I found them 9 packages of ornate glass marbles arranged in a perfect circle on the floor between 2 shelving units. I stared uncomprehending. We didn't sell marbles. I had never seen this product in our inventory. Each package contained different colored spheres that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the harsh overhead lighting. I knelt to examine them, my heart hammering against my rib cage. The packages bore no manufacturer name, no barcode, no pricing information, just the glass orbs visible through clear plastic. When I picked one up, it felt unnaturally cold against my fingertips. I returned them to their shelves, making a mental note to ask Harren about them. When we next spoke, I tried calling him that night, but the call went straight to voicemail. I left a casual message, deliberately avoiding mentioning the strange occurrences. Something instinctive warned me against articulating what had happened. Instead, I simply asked about the marbles, framing it as an inventory question. The following days passed without incident, almost lulling me into dismissing my concerns. But exactly 1 week later I was restocking shelves when all the lights in the store flickered simultaneously. The ancient radio I kept on for company emitted a burst of static before falling silent. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in seconds, my breath suddenly visible in front of me. The footsteps began again, but different, this time heavier, deliberate. They moved faster than before, pacing the length of the storeroom with purpose. My entire body went rigid, a primal part of my brain screaming danger. I looked toward the front door, calculating how quickly I could reach it. When the sound abruptly stopped, 10 seconds of silence passed 20. I began to edge toward the exit when I heard a single sharp tap against the storeroom door, as if someone had knocked once with a metal object. I'm not proud of what I did next. I fled. I bolted through the front door without locking up, without even turning off the lights. I ran 3 blocks to my car, my lungs burning and legs weak. Only when I was safely inside, with the doors locked, did I notice I was still clutching a feather duster in a white-knuckled grip. I sat there for nearly an hour, my breathing gradually slowing. Rationality began to reassert itself. I had been working long hours. The building was old. My imagination, fueled by isolation and the inherently creepy atmosphere of an old store at night, had simply gotten the better of me. At least that's what I told myself as I drove back to properly close the shop. The front door was locked. When I returned, I distinctly remembered leaving it unlocked in my panic. Yet here it was securely fastened. My key still worked, however, and I entered cautiously. All the lights were off, though I was certain I'd left them on. The familiar scent of dust and aged wood had been replaced by something sharper, like ozone. After a lightning strike, I moved through the darkened store by the glow of my phone's flashlight, heading straight for the storeroom. The door stood partially open, a sliver of deeper darkness beyond. I pushed it wide, fumbling for the light switch. What I saw froze the blood in my veins. Every single box in the storeroom had been arranged on the floor in concentric circles, hundreds of them creating an elaborate spiral pattern that radiated from the center of the room. At the very middle sat a single package of those strange glass marbles, this one containing spheres of such a deep black they seemed to create a void in the light. I approached slowly, my shoes echoing unnaturally loudly on the concrete. I felt watched from every angle, the weight of invisible eyes pressing against my skin. When I reached the center and bent to pick up the package of black marbles, my fingers brushed against the plastic and every light in the storeroom exploded simultaneously. In the sudden darkness, I heard whispering, dozens of overlapping voices speaking words just below the threshold of comprehension. The air grew dense. Difficult to breathe, I stumbled backward, colliding with boxes as I desperately sought the exit. My phone had died, leaving me in absolute darkness. I spent what felt like hours crawling through the labyrinth of inventory, repeatedly encountering dead ends where passages should have been. The whispering continued, occasionally rising to a crescendo before falling to near silence. At some point I began whispering back, begging to be released. The darkness seemed to thicken in response, becoming almost viscous around me. When I finally found the door, dawn was breaking outside. I collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping like a drowning man finding air. A passing delivery worker asked if I needed help. I must have looked deranged. Clothes, disheveled eyes, wild face streaked with tears. I didn't remember shedding. I called in a locksmith that morning. Had every lock in the place changed, I swept up the broken glass from the storeroom lights, replaced the bulbs and meticulously returned every box to its proper shelf. The black marbles were nowhere to be found. That night I received a text message from an unknown number. They're arranged in circles because that's how they travel. Don't break the pattern. I tried calling Harren again, this time leaving an urgent message explaining everything. His phone went straight to voicemail. I contacted the emergency number. He'd left supposedly his cousin in Phoenix. The woman who answered claimed no relation to anyone named Harren Pierce. Over the next few days I researched the building's history at the local library. The structure had originally housed a society called the Circular Order of the Eternal Sphere, a quasi-religious organization from the late 1800s. Their beliefs centered around interdimensional beings that could only cross into our world through perfectly circular portals. The society had disbanded after a tragic fire in 1912 that claimed 17 lives. The records indicated that first responders had found the victims arranged in a circle with no signs of attempting to escape the flames. I should have quit, then anyone rational would have walked away. But financial desperation and, if I'm honest, a growing obsession kept me returning to Harlan's curiosities. Each day I installed motion-activated cameras throughout the store, focusing particularly on the storeroom. I brought in an electrician to check the wiring, a plumber to inspect the pipes, even a pest control expert to rule out animals. They found nothing unusual. The cameras, however, told a different story. Each night, between 2:37 a.m. and 2:39 a.m., they recorded static, just 2 minutes of snow, after which everything appeared unchanged, except things were changing. Inventory shifted positions, items I didn't stock appeared on shelves, and always, the storeroom door would be unlocked in the morning, despite my religious adherence to securing it each night. Last night I decided to stay. I hid in the storeroom itself, concealed behind a shelving unit, determined to witness whatever occurred during those missing 2 minutes. I brought a flashlight, my phone, a digital camera and a baseball bat, though what protection I thought it would provide against something that could manipulate electricity and move through locked doors I can't say. At 2:36 a.m. the temperature dropped precipitously. My phone died first, followed by the flashlight. The darkness that enveloped me felt alive, pulsing, breathing. The footsteps began circling my position with impossible awareness of my location. I remained motionless, scarcely breathing as they completed 7 precise circuits around me. Then they stopped directly in front of my hiding place in the absolute darkness. I felt something lean close, so close. I could feel cold breath against my face. A voice barely above a whisper, but somehow filling the entire room, spoke 5 words. "Harlan isn't coming back, Daniel." The overhead lights blazed to life, momentarily blinding me. When my vision cleared, I was alone in the storeroom. Everything was in its proper place. No circles, no strange merchandise. My phone powered back on, displaying 2:39 a.m. I'm writing this now from a motel 30 m away. I left the keys in the mailbox with a note explaining I could no longer manage the store. I've been calling everyone who might know Harlan, trying to piece together who he really was so far. No one from his supposed past remembers him. But the strangest development came this morning. While emptying my pockets, I found a small object I don't remember acquiring, a single black glass marble cold to the touch, with what appears to be tiny shifting patterns suspended in its depths. As I write these words, I occasionally glance at it sitting on the nightstand, and I could swear the patterns are gradually arranging themselves into a circle, and somewhere in the back of my mind I can hear footsteps approaching.